here. Thank you for participating in this. This has been a book. I actually read this a while back. So this is another episode of the Bitcoiner Book Club. We are covering today The Law by Frederic Bastiat, written in, I believe, 1850, shortly before his death. He's French. And, I think this is a really, what I was going to say is I think this is a really relevant book today, but obviously it was a very relevant, philosophy and political discourse back then. And I think you could probably make the case throughout most of history that his thought here is relevant, which speaks to a couple things, not least is how similar our problems and our pitfalls appear to be and how they recur throughout time as we move forward. I want to get into all that, but I think two things that I want to get kicked off with. First, if you guys could just give a brief intro of yourselves so everyone knows who we're dealing with here. And then I'm going to give a little bit of context for this book so that people know the basic premise and the times in which it was written. So John, why don't we get started with you?
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm John Silvestro. I'm an active duty Marine officer, which gives me some reading through this, kind of gives me some interesting thoughts and inputs on it. I've also started a small fund, so I'm a small fund manager, mostly Bitcoin, and basically I'm class of 2017 and similar. I've read this book before as well, really the beginning of my Bitcoin days, really before I fully understood the implications of Bitcoin, and rereading it recently, I think it's been a really interesting exercise, and it looks through a very different lens. So I'm excited to talk about it today.
Sweet. Colin?
I'm Colin. Most people probably know me better as Heavily Armed Clown. I'm the clown on Twitter. I know there's many of us, but I'm the only one that's heavily armed. And then a lot of people know my website, WTF happened in 1971. And like John, we're going to have to figure out a way to differentiate you two, because I just realized you're both named John.
Call me Sweat. My call sign is Sweats. So I'm an aviator. You can just call me Sweats if you want.
Sweats it is.
Yeah.
You'll have to tell us the story about that name.
Yeah, maybe.
So I like John, I've read this book, I think it was like 4 years ago, and I had been meaning to reread it lately, and it's fun. Isn't it funny how like the universe syncs? Or maybe it was just the fact that Breedlove mentioned it and we were all like, oh yeah, Bastiat. Rereading this and with the perspective that Bitcoin has given me, particularly over the last 2 years, it's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, the like you said, the historical context, like this is gonna be a good conversation.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to try something I haven't done before. Hopefully it works out. But basically, I've plucked a few passages from the book all throughout. I think there's 5 different spots, and I'm hoping by reading these, I'm going to give people that haven't read the book a pretty round articulation of the entire book, then a little context, and then we'll just dive into our particular insights and things that we learned and want to discuss with it. So I don't think this should take too long. Bear with me. I'll try to read it relatively quickly. But so the first passage goes like this. Nothing, therefore, can be more evident than this. The law is the organization of the natural right of lawful defense. It is the substitution of collective for individual forces for the purpose of acting in the sphere in which they have a right to act, of doing what they have a right to do, to secure persons, liberties, and properties, and to maintain each in its right so as to cause justice to reign over all. Next section. Absence of plunder. This is a principle of justice, peace, order, stability, conciliation, and of good sense, which I shall proclaim with all the force of my lungs till the day of my death. Legal plunder has 2 roots. One of them, as we have seen, is in human greed. The other is in misconceived philanthropy. When a portion of wealth passes out of the hands of him who has acquired it without his consent and without compensation to him who has not created it, whether by force or by artifice, I say that property is violated, that plunder is perpetuated. I declare that I do not mean to impugn the intentions nor the morality of anybody. I am attacking an idea that I believe to be false, a system that appears to me to be unjust, and this is so independent of intentions that each of us profits by that each of us profits by it without wishing it and suffers from it without being aware of the cause. Almost there. The law is justice. Nothing can be more clear and simple, more perfectly defined and bounded, or more visible to every eye. For justice is a given quantity, immutable and unchangeable, and which admits of neither increase nor diminution. Depart from this point, make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, industrial, literary, or artistic, and you will be lost in vagueness and uncertainty. You will be upon unknown ground in a forced utopia, or, what is worse, in the midst of a multitude of contending utopias, each striving to gain possession of the law and to impose it upon you. For fraternity and philanthropy have no fixed limits as justice has. Where will you stop? Where is the law to stop? One person, Mr. St. Crick, will only extend his philanthropy to some of the industrial classes and will require the law to slight the consumers in favor of the producers. Another, like Mr. Considerant, will take up the cause of the working classes and claim for them by means of the law, at a fixed rate, clothing, lodging, food, and everything necessary for the support of life. A third, Mr. Louis Blanc, will say, and with reason, that this would be an incomplete fraternity and that the law ought to provide them with tools of labor and education. A fourth will observe that such an arrangement will leave room for inequality and that the law ought to introduce into the most remote hamlets luxury, literature, and the arts. This is the high road to communism. In other words, legislation will be, as it is now, the battlefield for everybody's dreams and everybody's covetousness. And finally, I believe that my theory is correct. For whatever be the question upon which I am arguing, whether it be religious, philosophical, political, or economical, whether it affects well-being, morality, equality, right, justice, progress, responsibility, property, labor, exchange, capital, wages, taxes, population, credit, or government, at whatever point of the scientific horizon I start from, I invariably come to the same thing. The solution of the social problem is in liberty. Boom. Yeah, so I think for people that have not read the book, that gives a little bit of an idea of what the kind of the primary theme of the book is and what obviously the author was trying to convey. And the last point for context is that this was written, do you guys know? I think it was 1850. So, and I think he died that year or very shortly thereafter. So for just, I'm no expert in early 19th century France, but basically you had the revolution at the end of the 18th century. You know, the monarchy was disbanded and you had, you know, a lot of different political ideas and philosophies and ideologies competing. It was a very tumultuous period. Then and the history of the assignats, the currency that the revolution instituted to fund effectively their government, is a very interesting history. But long story short, it ended in disaster and hyperinflation and things of that nature. And then, you know, we had Napoleon, and then we had Napoleon go away, and we had another form of government. Now, it was just very tumultuous and oftentimes bloody time in the early 18th century or late 18th century, early 19th century France. And so it's interesting to consider that context when we think of a guy who's just looking at all this chaos and looking at all these competing political philosophies and ideologies and seeing all the carnage that it's wreaking, but also knowing that there's an element, there's a vein of progress here to try to, you know, get out of the feudal system that France had been in prior to that, and try to ascertain, like, what is the best approach to the social problem? What is the best approach to governance? And this was what he produced. And, you know, I'm inclined to agree with his assessment. But I've been talking for a while now, so I'm going to hand it over to you guys just for initial thoughts on the book. John, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'll start. So like I said, let's see, it was Eric Voskuil, who runs the Bitcoin. He's a former naval aviator. We met at a conference years ago, and I was looking for, hey, you know, I'm looking to learn more. So, you know, for myself, I think personally, I've always had sort of an ethos of libertarianism, which is, as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, and as long as they're not hurting me, I don't really care what you do with your time. I never understood how you could really implement that at the state level. And Eric sort of was trying to push me on that and recommended that I read the law, which I read back in 2017. But it didn't really click for me, certainly not in the way that I've read it this time. Because I think, John, you and I talked about this, or we kind of, which is like a lot of things that I learned in college and economics and philosophy, always felt like this academic exercise rather than something we could actually do something about, right? And I think in 2017, when I read this, it sort of felt similar of like, okay, that's great, interesting points, but man will always sort of tend towards this, like water, man is lazy, men will tend towards this socialist idea, or this what he defines as plunder. But reading it again with the last 4 years behind me, it's amazing how much getting farther into Bitcoin, but also seeing what has happened in the United States, how it does feel like we are tending more towards this acceptance of socialist ideas. Things that would have never gotten past the starting gate in years past now are being pushed by senators and representatives and other people that and I think this comes back to 2008 and that fundamental shift of watching the elite, big banks, whatever institutions you're talking about, get bailed out for mistakes that they made. Something that maybe we thought was impossible before 2008 and before sort of that came along. And he talks about, Bastiat talks about in the book, this idea that we will legislate plunder because essentially those that have legislation can plunder legally. And so you watch the elites get it, they get bailed out, the banks get bailed out. Well, now it's our turn, right? COVID hits. And now people are looking around and saying, well, why not me? Why can't we get bailed out? And then you see, mortgages being turned off and rent payments being turned off because why not? We've already seen that we did it for them. Why not me? And you see the slippery slope just, speeding up and getting faster and faster and faster and faster. I think, what was it? Representative Ilhan Omar the other day was on TV saying she wants to get rid of all mortgage payments and rent payments till April of 2022. And when you look at it and you say, how could people think that that's something we could do as a society? Who's going to pay for that? Well, we've already done it. We did it for the banks. Why not my turn? And I really think that it is a fundamental lens that I look at the world differently because of Bitcoin that has allowed me to say, wait a second, this, we need to look at this another way. And now we have a tool to do it. And we'll get into the connection with Bitcoin later, but I did sort of come at this with, it's like showing up to a gunfight. Before, all I had was my hands, but now we have a gun, and so I can understand this through a different lens to say, hey, we can build a new world that doesn't require the legal plunder of everybody. Bastiat says, he says there's sort of three COAs, three courses of action. The few that plunder the many, everybody plunders everybody, or nobody plunders anybody, right? Those are the three categories of basically society that we can build. And he pushes for, obviously, in this book, that nobody plunders anybody. But before Bitcoin, I don't know, there isn't an obvious way to implement that. And so I found that reading that part really sort of hit home. I was like, oh, wait. Hold on, Bastiat. Come back to life in 2021. We got this new thing. It might actually be able to implement what you're talking about. So I found it really fascinating. I'm really excited. I got a bunch of things written down. I don't think I've torn apart a book like this in a long time. So yeah, it was fun.
Nice. Colin, initial impressions?
So I'll say first and foremost, this book, it really speaks to what a logical and concise thinker Bastiat was, because I think just about every single sentence in this book, or snippets, several sentences, stand on their own. I mean, you can pull so many quotes out of this book out of context of the rest of the work, and they just make phenomenal one-liners. I mean, I actually tweeted something he said just the other day, and the book itself sort of gave me a lot of cohesion in a lot of the ideas that I've been mulling over in the last year or two. Ideas around morality and society, and the types of fruit that what the institution and the legislation, what they sort of coalesce around, and the types of fruit that bears in society. It inspired me so much. I actually wrote an article about it. I don't know if either of you guys got the chance to read it. I mean, I wouldn't expect so, but really, it's actually incredible. When you go back and look at societies throughout history, you see these patterns emerge over and over and over, exactly in the ways that Bastiat speaks to in this book. And it's amazing that what he was going through, 200 years ago almost, is the same problem that we're dealing with today. I mean, it's almost uncanny. Has humanity been that incapable of learning from its past mistakes? Even in early colonial America, we were seeing legislators talk about, well, why should we tax our constituents when we can just load up the money printer and pay for everything however we want? It's amazing that these aren't new problems, and we're having to learn the same lessons over and over and over again instead of listening to this wisdom. And that's why I say Bastiat's ability to be concise and logical speaks to itself. Each sentence stands on its own. Like he doesn't even have, because it's so first principled in its thinking. You can't argue with this idea that the law should exist to protect liberty. And you can't argue with the inevitable consequences that always arise in all of these societies that break that social contract, right? That deviate from that moral guideline. And this is what I actually talked about in my article, was that morality is simply a system of behavior patterns that typifies our behavior to certain inputs and outputs, right? If we do this, we get this. If we do that, we get that. And whenever morality breaks down, and you have this system of legalized plunder, like John was saying, you have, it's like this spiral, and it spirals out of control. And the next thing the legislature has legalized theft, the institution has moralized theft. And like, to expand a little bit on what you said, what he talks about suffrage, and how a system of limited plunder is only sustainable under limited suffrage. But as that legalization of theft and that moralization of theft continues to proliferate, and you move towards unlimited suffrage, where there's much more unilateral representation in like a democratic society, it inevitably descends into total plunder. Because like you said, we look at them and we say, hey, why do they get that? I want that. And it becomes, rather than the few stealing from the many, everybody stealing from everybody.
Yeah. When I read stuff like this, as you were saying, like these dynamics, these problems continue to recur. And I know like this inevitably leads to why Bitcoin is so special, right? Because it fundamentally changes the ways in which we're able to organize and interact, and as a result, structure our interactions. Because of, well, I want to preserve that. We'll get into that. But, it reminds me that I suspect throughout the ages, the example I often use is like the two homies that were sitting on the Nile someday, when the pyramids were being built. And, like, I'm sure many people were wrapped up in the current zeitgeist as people are now, and they were supportive of it. But, there was a cohort of free thinking people that were like, man, what the fuck? Why the fuck are we building that shit? Why are we spending so many of our resources doing that? And slavery's kind of, slavery doesn't sound like a good idea to me. But they're like, oh, whatever. What are we going to change? We're just two dudes sitting on the Nile having figs and, looking at crocodiles or whatever, and the fact that these free thinking people throughout the ages could see through the facade and the chaos and the delusion of the current time that they were in, to try to dig down to something more truthful and maybe more fair and maybe more right and maybe more reasonable. And I feel like Bastiat is another instantiation of that. And not to toot our own horns, but I think Bitcoiners are largely that as well. I mean, we exist in a world right now not dissimilar at all. In fact, probably, I think the current paradigm would horrify Bastiat. Like, as chaotic as his time was, I think you could make a case that the intrusion of government and the mechanics or the machine of global social governance and the structures in place to administrate that are far more imposing today than they even were in his time. And so I think, he would be horrified by this time, but I think we, like him, are the people that are able to step back from it and say, to look at history, put it in context, and say, why is it we're doing it this way? And like you were saying, Colin, like this just degenerates. And the one-liner in the book that I love is the competing utopias line. Like we see that so often now in the political discourse, like this faction wants this to happen and this faction wants this to happen. And everyone, because that thing has become so powerful and influential, the main drive of everyone to get what they want is to co-opt that thing, to co-opt the head of the beast, to co-opt the machine. And he talks about that in this, rather than people pursuing their own ends, right? Like deploying their labor, their energies, their intellect to create value. The most rational way to get what you want almost is to, instead of doing that and the pain required to actually deploying your own labor, is actually to just try to co-opt the thing that is able to plunder for free, right? And that expands the political discourse of the time. It makes politics all consuming. It makes it the biggest issue of the land. And what do we have today? I mean, politics is everywhere. It's a clown show. I mean, look at the most recent election. I don't care what side of the aisle you were on, but it's this all-consuming thing that's on the TV 24 hours a day. It's the main news topic all the time because it's ballooned to that level of influence on our lives. When, what Bastiat would say is that it should just protect our liberties so that people can go forth and do what they want. And so, I think we're in a time where this is potentially, it's never been more relevant than now. And, that's why I think it's an interesting book for people to become aware of, and for this line of thinking to start permeating into the social world. Like so many people, and like, here in Canada, it may be worse than most places, just assume that the government's role is to fix all problems, right? If there's an issue, the government should step in to fix it. And if there's something that needs to be done, it need to be built, need to be like it all goes back to the government. And that's such a abdication of responsibility first. But I think it is destructive ultimately, because as we know, the government, is not a creator of value. It's it administers value. It takes it from one place and moves it to another. And ultimately, I think it's self-destruct. So what do you guys make of this vein through history and how Bitcoin influences this line of thinking? And I asked a little more context on that question. In the Bitcoin space, we talk about politics a lot. Like obviously, many of us are critical of the current structure, but it begs the question, what does governance look like in a Bitcoin denominated world? And some people are on the anarcho-capitalist side, and some people think there's going to be some form of governance. What does reading this book and your understanding of Bitcoin, how has that influenced your perception of governance, what governance will look like in the future? Colin, why don't you take that one?
One thing I wanted to add right before we get was, he brings up a couple times in the book talking about the relationship between legislators and the governed. He uses, the gardener and his trees, I think is sort of the example, but he used a couple others, which is like the people are there to be experimented on, right? Which this is written in 1850, right? So this is pre-Darwin, 1859. This is Mendel and his peas in 1865. This is pre-eugenics. And yet he still saw that legislators treated people as if they were something to be fixed, right? Like there was something that needed to be, that you have this legislator who is this great person or a great entity, and yet sees the people as generally degenerative and in need of, I think he says, formation. And we see that over and over and over again throughout history. And he mentions, he talks about how you would think we'd be getting better over the millennia. But if you look back to Egypt and the slavery and what was done and how people were used, and then into the Roman times, and then medieval times, and then the rest, and through and through time, and then obviously post this book, post his life, you see it again and again, and he talks about this idea of stopping plunder, right? Like that's what we need to do as a society. That's what we need to do as governance, is stop plunder, which is an interesting thought. But if you look at different civilizations and those that have really tried to stop plunder, what it usually means is constant revolution, just revolution after revolution after revolution. Somebody else takes power, they try it, they make the same mistakes the ones before them did. You see another revolution. I mean, look at Italy. Since World War II has 61 different governments. That's a different government every 1.4 years since World War II. And that is that reach for, we just need to stop this plunder and then we'll be good. The society will be good. But when that new group or that new governance comes in, they make the same mistakes because, as he said, all plundered try to somehow enter into making laws. Either they may wish to stop lawful plunder or they may wish to share in it, right? And so I think my favorite sort of part of the whole book, and I don't know if you guys do you have this copy? Is this what you guys are working on?
I got this one.
Okay. So this is on page 10 in my book, but it's relatively early in the book. He says, this fatal desire has its origin in every nature of man, which I agree with. In that primitive, universal, and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain, right? So we as humans are like water, right? We're lazy. We will find the easiest route to our goals, whatever that may be. So then in the next chapter or the next paragraph, which is property and plunder, it says, man can live and satisfy his wants only by ceaseless labor. This process is the origin of property. But it is also true that man may live and satisfy his wants by seizing and consuming the products of the labor of others. This process is the origin of plunder. So you're talking about tweets. Like you could take line by line and be like, oh, here's a great tweet. And people will be like, oh man, that guy's smart. But yeah, those two right there, right? You have the process, the origin of property, which is ceaseless labor, and the process, the origin of plunder. So over a period of time, you're going to move towards plunder because ceaseless labor is exhausting when plunder exists, right? If I can plunder my way to what I want to do, it's like, do I want to climb over the wall or go around it or go through the gate, right? I can go through the gate. Why would I ever go over the top? And so, we as people will always move toward, I think there's that, I've seen a few tweets about this, or, kind of the memes of, hard times create capitalists create good times create socialists create bad times. And so the thing progresses again. And I think Brandon Quittam's Fifth Turning and reading The Fourth Turning by House, I think is something everybody in the Bitcoin space should read. And you see these again and again, like these generational turns. I mean, it just makes so much sense. But now, Bitcoin, finally get back to my Bitcoin point. Bitcoin, as Brandon says, could be this fifth turning. And in this particular case, I see Bitcoin as being a replacement for ceaseless labor, right? So you can have Bitcoin be that ceaseless labor that's actually easier in a way than plunder. And so maybe that's the tool, maybe that's the key that we've been looking for, is like you can store your value in this thing that will continue to get more valuable over time. You don't need to plunder the other people in your society in order to get ahead. And maybe that's the key. Maybe that's the tool that somebody like Bastiat and people who have thought this way, libertarian thinkers have thought this way, maybe the key to unlocking this possible future where plunder doesn't need to be the default end state.
Those are really good points. That's really profound. I think I look at it maybe like kind of in the same way, but a little bit differently. I think a really good accompanying piece to this is one of Bastiat's other works, and it was just a paper, and it was called "Ce qu'on voit et ce qu'on ne voit pas," and all that means is that which is seen and that which is unseen. And in this article that I wrote, I tell a little story about a man who's walking down a road, and just happens upon a fruit tree, and the fruit tree has just tons of delicious looking fruit on it, and he says, "Oh wow, what great luck I have. I can just stop and eat as much fruit as I want, and I'll be full and happy and satisfied." But what he doesn't see, right? He sees that fruit, and he sees that he can eat it, and he can be full and happy, and his immediate needs can be satisfied. But what he doesn't see is all of the hours of labor and time and capital and knowledge that went into planting and cultivating and growing and producing that fruit. And he doesn't see that he steals all of that time and capital and energy from his neighbor who's planted that tree so that he could eat from the fruit, right? That which is seen and that which is unseen. And really, this is what the biggest problem in economics, at least in modern academic economic theory, is that there's a whole lot of focusing on what is seen, and very, very little focusing on which is unseen. And this distills down, to the lowest level. And that's why I think that's a great example, because it shows a high level concept at its lowest level, right? That guy walking down the road, all he knows is that his stomach is growling and he wants to eat fruit off that fruit tree. And it's easy for him to do it, right? He can just reach out and take that, and there's no immediate consequence for him. There might be none at all, other than second order. Now the fruit farmer goes out of business and has to close down his farm, and the guy goes to the market to buy fruit, and he has to buy expensive imported fruit instead of what his neighbor would have sold him for, pennies. Those are consequences that man could not have possibly known. So when I say I look at it a little bit differently, I see Bitcoin as a technology. And I think a lot of times we get almost too hung up on talking about number go up. And don't get me wrong, I love number go up. But really what a lot of technologies have marked significant shifts in history is when they make Plunder less profitable, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, humans are always going to act in order with their incentives, right? And we know that the natural order has consequences, and we know that, like I said, morality ties us to certain systems of behavior that are mutually profitable for everybody. But we have this pesky problem that it's easier to just steal what you want, right? Even though that might make society less profitable, less wealthy as a whole, it's going to make you a lot better off, right? Because you're going to solve all of your problems right away without having to, sweat in the field. So a great example of this is just like a wall, right? What does a wall do? It makes theft less profitable, because now you have to send your roving band of barbarians up and over that wall, and they might get all shot up with arrows on the way, right? If there was no wall, it's a lot easier to just waltz right in and take what you want. Bitcoin is just a wall, right? It's a wall that makes plunder, direct theft of the person's time, a lot less profitable. And I think that when you look at it that way, and you think about it in the sense that we may never get to the point where everybody agrees with us, where everybody sits down and takes the time to read Bastiat, and we all sort of have this collective kumbaya where we're like, oh wow, it would just be better if people kept what they had and we didn't try to steal it. What Bitcoin really does is make theft unprofitable.
Yeah, and this ties in very nicely to, I think, the first book we covered in this book club, which is The Sovereign Individual, which is basically exactly what you just described, which is how the evolution of technology changes the quote unquote logic of violence. And it in many instances, it changes the payoff to plunder, let's say, or the payoff to violence. And as you said, I mean, I think it's always a case of quote unquote intellectuals that kind of explicitly explore these topics. That's the far minority. What the world ends up being, and what the social structure ends up being, is people simply playing to their incentives, right? And the point about pain is a good one. Like, and it's not bad in itself. Like, we will always seek the shortcut, the shortest route to whatever our objective is. And so it's almost natural that if you provide a mechanism for circumventing the necessity of pain to get what you want, i.e. a method of plunder, then people are probably going to take it. And you raised a great point, which because the morality piece and an individual acting, for themselves, I think oftentimes, and the reason why we see more or less you know, uh, we don't see this same behavior of the state reflected in the individual for this reason. I think we know, or I know, that if I rob you, if we're neighbors or whatever, and I rob you, then our relationship is not going to go well, right? You're not going to trust me in the future. I break the link between all the other interactions we may have in the future, opportunities for cooperation that can serve me or can serve both of us, right? So it's not a logical thing to do for me to burn that bridge with you to steal from you in some way. Coinciding with that, there is some involvement of morality. Now, I'm receptive to the case that morality is far less important to people than some people might like to think, whether it's the religious community or otherwise, and that we actually far more play to our incentives and our impulses and our drives. Like, that's an interesting conversation to have. But let's just assume morality plays some role in keeping our behavior in check, quote unquote. And I think that one of the issues, and one of the reasons why the state apparatus is so appealing, so addictive, is because it's sanctioned plunder, right? It removes the social and moral consequences from the individual of those two behaviors, right? And so it acts in a supra social and supra moral situation where, talking about burning that bridge with your neighbor or keeping you in moral check, both of those considerations are removed because it's sanctioned. And as you said, Colin, maybe in large part because it focuses on the seen and not the unseen, right? So it's more easy for it to receive social sanction, perhaps. But I think, and this leads to one of the points he makes in his book, which, he says, well, a good test of law, of the justness or the justice of law, is, can the state do something legally that would be a crime for the individual? I think, I don't know if that will apply across the board at all times, because maybe there has to be some distinction, but I think it's a good starting place. And man, if you apply that to our world today, the response it returns is not a good one, right? The state is capable of getting away with and participating in certain activities almost with complete impunity, and anything that they really choose to do. And as we can see, almost all the time in the news media, is that, people are increasingly restricted from doing things that they might do. So there's a huge asymmetry between what both entities are permitted in doing. And so, but yeah, I think that the fact that the plunder is sanctioned removes the moral and social quandary of each individual, and that is too appealing not to try to co-opt. And I think that's the story of history, a constant attempt to co-opt that, a degradation as a result of doing so, and then the next group swoops in and says, we'll do it better this time, and our ideology is better. And I think the US is a great example of this. I mean, like, as far as paper promises and paper rules are concerned, man, it was brilliant. The founding fathers and what they put in place. Like, I imagine a lot of thought and understanding of history went into that. But at the end of the day, it didn't change the nature of people, or that, it wasn't a technology, it was an ideology. And maybe it worked for a time, but as we can see, it degrades over time. And I agree that Bitcoin is one of those unique things that changes the logic of plunder, let's say, where before, violence could rule the day. You could take things from people if you needed them. That was the easiest way to come by them. And now, at least in the realm of money, the highest concentrated form of value, that can be removed from a realm that can be plundered upon. And how will we see society and culture shift, even subconsciously? Because like I said, I mean, most people aren't going to come at this from a conscious perspective. How will we see that change the dynamic of social interaction and social governance? That's the interesting thing that I'm, looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at America as this great American experiment. We hold the founding fathers in great regard for a reason. Here we are, almost 250 years later, and we still have essentially the same foundational governance. which is remarkable in the world. I mean, in the history, we have a lot of other benefits, like, two giant oceans between us and any real enemy that we have. But even Bastiat talks about in the book, he says America is this incredible nation that has been set up, and they've been thought through, and yet they had a civil war. They're on the brink of civil war, right? Because civil war is about to happen just a little bit after this book occurs, and it's on two things: in slavery and tariffs. So even in Bastiat's example of this nation that he holds in this high regard and high esteem, it only took two little problems, right? Little problems, which are tariffs and slavery, and you end up with a civil war. And so it seems almost impossible to create a perfect union, right? We create a more perfect union, but to create an actually perfect union in which you can seek liberty and happiness, eventually will be corrupted. And here we are 250 years later, and America is still this relatively powerful idea in the world. And I've been all over the world, and I've met people in different countries, and I've seen what real oppression looks like. And so don't get me wrong. I think that America is still holds itself up well, but with that comes a lot of questions about what the future kind of looks like. And we talked a little bit about Bitcoin as a tool for governance, but I also want to talk about the community of Bitcoin and what the fundamental thing about Bitcoiners that I hope that as more people adopt Bitcoin, we're seeing, and I think it takes some time, obviously, but there is a fundamental questioning of everything that Bitcoin allows you to start to go down, right? We've talked about the rabbit hole and the widening of the rabbit hole and how it's sort of this ceaseless, never-ending thing. I mean, here I am highlighting and underlining Bastiat after work on during my week, something I would have never gone this deep if it wasn't for Bitcoin, because you start to question the money, then you start to question the governance, then you start to question everything else. And Bastiat talks about constantly in this book the power of the legislator, and then the power of the state and the education that kind of all becomes all-encompassing. We've talked about how politics become all-encompassing. Well, politics eventually controls the narrative, and the narratives control education, and education controls us, right? So in the U.S., we all grew up with I think the thing that I use a lot when I'm talking to people and talking about why I question things, and something that relates to every public education, American public kid who went through public education, including myself, is the food pyramid, right? Like, we were taught this horrible, toxic food pyramid for our entire childhood. 14 servings of grain of carbohydrates a day, and you got to have amount of sugar. And I think people who are open-minded enough and are looking at that, they look at, here is the USDA, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States is telling you this is what you should eat, and look what it's done to Americans. I mean, and now people are starting to look at, especially the Bitcoin space. You see people are looking at carnivore diets, people are keto. They're questioning that, and it starts with those kinds of things. Okay, so if the government was essentially lying to me or misinforming me, whether they were doing it on purpose or whether they thought it was the right thing or not, they were wrong and they were misinforming about this. What else were they misinforming me about? And I think right now you're seeing two things, economically speaking, that are becoming dangerously accepted. And I'd say one is this idea of a wealth tax in the United States, and the other is this MMT idea, right? And you hear people talk about it. You hear and you see it. You see it on podcasts. You see it on the television. You see it in news articles of this idea that inflation is not a real thing, even though we continue to print money. Look, inflation numbers are the same. Obviously, we can keep printing money forever, and we can solve all our problems with that. So why wouldn't we do that? So we not only are we going down this slippery slope, we are attaching a rocket to the back of it and going down as fast as we possibly can. And to what history will tell us is an inevitable outcome, and it's being accepted and fed to us as if there is no other option, and that's because of the power of the state and the power of education. You know, Bitcoiners are attempting to make unlawful plunder impossible. Not just wanting to stop it, but making it physically impossible. You know, the Occupy Wall Street guys, they put up signs and they sat down in Lower Manhattan. Satoshi wrote code. I think that powerful idea is that Satoshi's, you know, an anonymous internet currency is going to give more power to people than anything that has been protested or attempted through legislation or otherwise. And the more people we get on board, the more people start to think differently. And I think that's, at least for me, that's been, you know, that's what I'm most thankful for. You know, the number go up is great. You know, the sick gains are great, but the difference in the way that I think about the world and the difference in the way that I think what is possible for the world, I think is the most powerful thing for me with Bitcoin. And I am hopeful, you know, and I've heard you kind of talk about this before, John, which is that, you know, that sense of nihilism that I had for most of my life of sort of, we are moving toward this inevitable future. There's nothing I can do about it. And there really is no hope for us to change that path. But I have hope now. I have optimism for a future that can be different, that can move us away from this idea of plunder. And I think a lot of Bitcoiners had this underlying sense of whether it was ennui or just distrust that led you to it in the first place. And now we are starting to be able to explain it better. And I love the content around it. You know, I think Colin's website, you know, I can't tell you how many people I have sent to WTF happened in 1971. You know, it is, look at this, you know, all you gotta say, just look. And, you know, I have arguments with a friend of mine who's a PhD economics professor, and he can't see it, right? He has these blinders. He when I show him your website, Colin, or I show him, okay, you don't think inflation exists? Let's look at asset prices. Let's look at housing prices. Let's look at healthcare. Let's look at the things that really matter, what you really spend your money on. And he says, oh, well, you're cherry picking, or he comes up with something. He just can't see through it. And it can't be that, you know, me, who's I'm a Marine Corps pilot. Like, how could I know more about this? Or how could I have an insight? Not know more. I shouldn't say I know more than him about economics, but how could I have an insight that he wouldn't be able to grasp or understand? And I think he's my white whale, right? He's the guy that I want. You know, if I can get him to Bitcoin, then I've done my work, and then he can pass it on to his students, and then a whole generation of Bitcoiners will be grown up. But yeah,
know your place, Marine.
But I do think, John, I think you're doing an incredible service, and I have shown people a lot of that website, and then it gets passed around again and again and again. I do want to come back to Nixon later because I had something else to add about that. But yeah, I think the community, although Bitcoin doesn't need us, I think that the community that Bitcoin is creating is starting to be one of its most powerful things for global change. And I know, because I've seen it, the more people that adopt Bitcoin, the more they change, they become more optimistic, more spiritual, more thought-provoked, more open-minded, whatever it is. I've seen it in myself, and I've seen it in the people around me. And that's what I have the most hope for in terms of what Bitcoin can do.
So some of the things you said there, I think are really important to pick apart. Like, I myself have found a lot of value in going back, particularly through early American history, and trying to focus on the parts that in my formal education were brushed over or swept under the rug. And the reason that I say that is because, you know, I love this country. I grew up in America. I grew up in the sticks, running around outside and killing squirrels and cooking them over fires and stuff like that. And I love America is very, what's the word? It's very romantic. Like, there's a lot of, like, I love the thinkers like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a phenomenal thinker, and it's worth everybody's time to go back and read, like, some of his works of writing and his letters. I mean, he was incredible. He was incredibly intelligent. Thomas Jefferson would have been a Bitcoiner. I guarantee you that. And yet, we go back and look at some of the early political events in early America and the early political parties, right? The Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Look at the Whiskey Rebellion. the Tariffs of Abomination, the Barbary Coast Wars, the Quasi Wars, the War of 1812. Like all of these were complicated problems for a government that by design was limited in terms of the authority that it granted to the federal government, and there was a lot of like political power struggle over that in the early days of America. But something like the Whiskey Rebellion is a great example of how America thrived just because it was able to protect its system of limited plunder for a very, very long time. And yeah, it's hard to come to grips with that as an American who loves the idea of liberty and freedom and, you know, stars and stripes and all those things. And I've wrestled with it for years. But if you really go back and study the history, you'll see that all of these political struggles, and like you said, like even the Civil War, you know, that was fought over tariffs. So that's why South Carolina seceded from the Union, is because of the Morrill Tariff Act. And really all it was, that was what sparked the revolution, right? It was the tea tax, and the tea tax was a heck of a lot less obtrusive than the taxes on whiskey during the Whiskey Rebellion. But America was able to prosper for so long because they created this system that was system of governance that was resilient and resistant to change, and limited the power of, you know, the central authority to balloon out of control and grant everyone universal suffrage, and just allow the system of total plunder. Because there had to be some plunder. Like if you don't believe that early America needed some plunder, go and read about the Barbary Coast Wars, right? America couldn't send its trade ships over to Europe. They kept getting captured by these Barbary and Tripoli and Moroccan pirates, who would take the sailors and turn them into slaves and just take the cargo and keep it. So how is this new fledgling young nation that just got through a war and has all this debt going to make its way in the world if it can't trade, you know, where all the money is? They had to build a navy, right? Because they had to solve this problem of defense. The same problem happened with the Quasi Wars. The Jefferson and Madison dissolved the central banks because they knew the problems that came with central banking. And then actually, it was Madison, I believe, who was president during the Quasi Wars. Jefferson had dissolved the central bank before he came in, and Madison couldn't fund the war efforts that he needed to fight. Man, I might be mixing up my timelines here. It might have been the War of 1812. I don't know. I don't remember. I did a podcast on this a while back, but it's been a while, so I haven't refreshed my memory on the specific details. But Jefferson dissolved the central bank, and then Madison comes in and says, wow, that was great. I'm glad we did that. And then he finds himself in this war where the state militias were supposed to be the ones that were protecting the Union, right? Like they're supposed to say, hey, New York's getting invaded. Well, let's send our troops up there to help. But Madison quickly found himself in a position where that couldn't really be coordinated because of the way that the government was set up, and he needed a centralized federal fighting force in order to be able to participate in this war and actually protect the sovereignty of the Union. So he had to reinstitute a new central bank so that he could borrow money to pay for this operation. Jefferson went through the same thing in the Barbary Coast Wars, having to pay for the Navy. And you run into this problem over and over and over, where as time goes on, with more and more reasons just seem to keep coming up. And then, you know, you have World War I, and I'm sure you guys know about like the Lusitania, and then World War II, and then that ends with Bretton Woods. And it's sort of like just this ever ballooning, creeping tendril of expansion of the system of plunder. And that was why America lasted for so long, was because it was able to limit that. And now we're sort of seeing the reins on the limit of that plunder just come off. And we're watching the consequences of that happen around us in real time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam War, I mean, perfect. 1971, right? That's why we came off. That's why Nixon did what he did. That's why your website exists, is the overextending of the American pocketbook to fund the Vietnam War. And now we are in the 20th year of our current conflict. 20 years. I mean, how are we paying for that? And you know, and I'm part of that, right? I'm part of the military-industrial complex, and the longer we go, and you know, you think about how expensive war is now, right? I think at one point, the height of the conflict in Afghanistan, we were spending $40 billion a year on air conditioning.
Yeah.
You know, and so and did that coincide with 2008? Was it 2008 that was caused by that? Or, and these sort of things get lost because we've been in this constant conflict now for so long that the cost of it becomes less and less clear, and the plunder of our monetary system gets hidden in these layers of like, oh well, we also had this financial crisis, so like that's really what was it? Well, wait, was it the financial crisis, or was it our overextension for violence? And so there is a place for national defense, but I think that has been perverted so many times over the course of a nation, and in some cases, a lot of cases, it leads to the ending of that nation, or at least the ending of that form of government for that nation.
I'd like to discuss the problem of national defense, or the problem of erecting that system of force, even if it's just there to preserve liberty. But just before we move on to that, we talk about plunder a lot, and the use of force and organized violence to exact plunder. And, that's the quickest road to get what you want. And so everyone ends up fighting for the ability to do that. But of course, money is the ultimate form of plunder. Like the ability to create money is the ultimate form of plunder, especially if you can do it at zero cost, right? The greater the seigniorage, the greater the plunder. And this has always been what everyone's been attempting to control. So like you're saying, like, yes, of course, push comes to shove, whether it's a civil war, an external war, a crisis internally, if you have that money printer in the basement, if you have that power to create money that you can then force everyone else to use, it's going to be used, and it's going to be used detrimentally. And, I mentioned at the beginning the experience of the assignats I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, but in France during the Revolution. And I believe they were instituted in 1789, and I think they lasted till 1795. Someone could correct me on that. But it's a nice little microcosm of how this all works. So the revolutionary government confiscated all the land from the clergy, right, from the church, which was an incredibly rich institution in France and had, a ton of wealth and a ton of land. They then issued these assignats based off the land, right? So the land was backing up the assignats on a whatever ratio, right? And then they self-imposed a limit on how many they would create. Now the revolutionary government bumped that up a couple times anyways. Instead of a 1-to-1, it's a 1-to-2 or a 1-to-3, right? As because push comes to shove, if you have that power, you're going to use it. But what's interesting is that this is always a double-edged sword for governments, right? So the Lord of the Rings analogy is so apt, right? Like the ring of power, right? The money printer, it can give you so much power. It can allow you to do so many things, but it also sows the seeds of your own destruction, because you will not use it properly. Or maybe said even better, if you decide to use it, you've already ensured your destruction, because using it, just by virtue of using it. And in the case of the assignats in the revolutionary government, ultimately what its downfall was not just that they were making more of them, like intentionally, but the nobility and the clergy that had left France during the revolution started counterfeiting it themselves and flooding the market with it, so that it continued to be debased until it was worthless. Right. So when you play that game of trying to create value out of thin air and presuming to have the power to do so, maybe you're able to leverage that power for a time, but it's also going to ultimately destroy you, and that power will ultimately self-destruct. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that that's what we're encountering today. I think we're in the later innings of the egregious abuse and the forced, use of this type of money that we use all around the world today. It's lost a tremendous amount of its value. It's led to a lot of tragic consequences that I think individuals would not have decided to embark on by their own volition, or if they had the choice, but because they did not have the choice, and that enormous power was granted to a very small group of people with their own set of interests, history is what it was. So, and that's been largely the story of history. You know, that the money has been co-opted in some way, shape, or form, and then the money that people were forced to use, or the money that a certain group of people or nation used for a period of time, went a long way to dictating not only the institutions that were erected around it to administer it or enforce it, et cetera, but the actual outcomes of history as a result of that huge imbalance of power being abused. And you know, I think that's where we are today. And like both of you, I think Bitcoin is a huge tool to counteract that and start turning the tide. But it begs the question for me, I'd love to get your input on this. And John, you were saying, you know, how coming into this space, you know, now in your free time, you're reading, you know, books from old French philosophers and stuff like that. And I think we can all relate to that. And it's awesome. And I find it so intellectually stimulating and satisfying. But is there, like, if you're Bastiat, right? And no kind of understanding how these things unfold as we've been discussing, is there a point at explicitly articulating philosophies of this kind, you know, like better methods of governance or ideologies or whatever, or is the best approach just to focus on the technologies at hand that can preserve liberty to the utmost extent? Like, is it a both thing, or are people just wasting their breath and their time by articulating things that can't realistically exist in the technological paradigm in which they exist?
Colin, I've got some thoughts. Colin, you want to take that, or?
I don't know, that's what you were just saying, John, right before that is kind of reminding me of I've recently read through the Tao of Capital like 2 or 3 times. I don't know if either of you have ever read that book by Mark Spitznagel, but he talks a lot about Taoism and Laoism and like the writings of Sun Wu and this concept called Shi. John, you might be familiar with some of these things with all the time you spent in China. I don't know, or actually, other John, you might also be familiar with some of these things, being a Marine Corps officer. You know, in this concept of like Shi and Li, and Shi being like this sort of roundabout strategy of arriving at a particular end. And Mark Spitznagel uses the example of conifers and the way that they spread their seeds throughout forests and start in the less ideal locations and in the more rocky areas, and bide their time and wait for when everything else gets wiped out during like a fire or something like that, and then they just take over. And I know this is sort of esoteric, but it I don't know, you look at these systems where they have this immediate problem and they say, well, we got to print the money. It really sort of defies that Taoist or, you know, Laoist logic of the roundabout strategy that like sort of wait for a good opportunity to maneuver. You know, it's not like human beings are incapable of understanding these principles, you know, and it's not like there aren't examples in history of extremely incredible thinkers who rise to the top and make societies extremely successful or extremely profitable, despite the fact that they might be dictatorships. I mean, look at Napoleon, right? I mean, he was a tyrant, but or Alexander the Great, like he was a tyrant, but he rose to the top and quite literally conquered the world. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but that's sort of what I'm thinking about at the moment.
So I'll, you know, in terms of is it important? I think it's remarkable, right? Like reading this book, I think is remarkable because it's like standing in front of a tsunami you know is coming, and thinking that it's important for you to scream at the tsunami as it you know wipes out your town, right? Whereas now, like I said, you know, reading this 4 years ago, I was like, cool, you know, that's interesting. You know, I wish we could live in that world. I wish we could stop Plunder. I wish. Now it feels like you have, you know, I think people use the term arc all the time in Bitcoin. It's like there's the flood is coming. This monetary flood is here. It's coming. It's been in the works for a really long time. We have this, now we have a tool, we have an arc. We can float over this tsunami that is going to wipe out our town. And so I find it remarkable that this education, that these thoughts were happening in the face of certainty, essentially, right? Like socialism clearly won in France, and it is won as it is won in a lot of places. And yet there were people like Bastiat, and there were people thinking this way and articulating it. So do I think it's important? Yes. Do I think it's even more important now? Yeah. So like, in today's parlance, in our example, it would be as if the white paper came out and then nothing else, right? And then no other information. Satoshi didn't answer any emails. You don't have the Nakamoto Institute. You don't have the YouTubers and the books. And, my coffee table is literally covered 5 Bitcoin books right now, right? I'm just finishing Layered Money. I've got Thank God for Bitcoin, 21 Lessons, Crypto Economics, News Van Holmes. I got this T-shirt on. Like without that stuff, without that community, without that education, I think the fact the tool exists now has opened up a whole new world of philosophers and thinkers that are going back and looking at this stuff. And so while I'm glad that Bastiat wrote this, and I'm so impressed that he was thinking in this way, like you said, almost 200 years ago. The fact that it's so much more convincing now, right? The fact that I can say, hey, here are all these thoughts that have been thought and pondered and philosophized over the years. And by the way, here's this thing that can help us really implement it. It's so powerful. I think I highlighted a little section here that I wanted to read real quick. If I had it. So he's talking about, he says, they assume that if the legislators left, so this was sort of, to tell a relatively personal story. I think there's this feeling, especially for me when I was younger, this feeling that like, if only, the right people could get in charge, we could solve all these problems, right? If only my party or my group or my ideals or my ideologies could be implemented, we could solve it, right? And I think The Lord of the Rings is a perfect example, right? Like if only we could hold the ring, then we could, we had the printer, we could implement, I think Andrew Yang's UBI was a really big, people really grasped onto that idea of like, yeah, that seems like, and it's enticing that like, okay, yeah, if Andrew Yang was president, we'd have UBI and all our problems would be solved. It's such a dangerous thought, right? It's such a intoxicating belief and such an intoxicating thought. It's impossible to get away from this idea that like, oh man, Obama's going to change the world, or Trump is going to change the world, or this is very American centric, but I think that definitely plays of like, okay, yeah, we got our guy, here we go, everything's going to be great now. And then you fast forward 4 years or 8 years or 16 years or whatever, and you're like, man, not much really changed. Nothing really happened, even though our guy won. And I think that for me, that was a wake up call of like, okay. And I came from a liberal background, and I was a diehard Democrat, and I was a big Obama supporter, and he gets in office, he's got the House, he's got the Senate, and what happens? Not much, right? Not much really changes. More of the status quo, we get more of the same. We get, and this is before I really understood the importance of the money printer. But you keep getting these same consequences, and then Trump comes in, which is like the total antithetical, at least in general, the top of the mind, and again, nothing really changes. There's the level of rhetoric goes up maybe, and the discourse goes down, but it didn't seem to really change anything. And so this passage that I highlighted, he says, they assume that the legislators left persons free to follow their own inclinations, they would arrive at atheism instead of religion, ignorance instead of knowledge, poverty instead of production exchange. So the legislators are here to bring us to the promised land, right? And to me, and I wrote this down, Bitcoiners are antithetical proof of this conceit. BTCers are curious, spiritual, productive, and enlightened. And I am all four of those things. I am I am more of all four of those things than I ever have been, right? I am curious in a way that I've never been before. I am spiritual in a way that I've never been before. I mean, I'm a nihilist atheist for most of my life, or really agnostic towards religion and belief in that. And I'm not that way anymore. I'm more productive. And Bitcoin has, I have stopped, I don't drink alcohol anymore. Right. And people ask me, oh, did you, they assume I had a problem with alcohol or something. And really what it comes down to is like, I want to be sharp because I want to learn, right? I want to learn, and I want to know, and there's so much to know, and there's so much out there. And that brings me to another point in the book, this great line kind of at the end, which he says, I might have to take a minute and find it, but he talks about the lack of men being able to be men, or man being able to be man, right? The power of the state takes away the point of being curious, of being intellectual, which I felt, I went to a good school, a college, and I always felt this underlying of like, what's the point, right? Why be, the game is fixed, the game is rigged. Why be curious? Why be intellectual? Why study these things? Why chase this wealth? What's the point? And Bitcoin has given me a focus to say, oh, there's a point. There's a point to be educated. There's a point to be informed. You can save yourself. You can better your position. You can help your family. You can help those around you. You can be a power for good in the world. Things are not so dark and bleak. And, I think that has been really profound on a personal level. And again, I see it across the board. And I know, John, I know you've talked about it. I've listened to a few of your podcasts about it. Colin, I can sense that you feel, sort of similar feelings. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe all these Bitcoiners have felt this way their whole lives. But for me, it has been a remarkable shift in my general perspective on the world.
Well, if I can just jump in real quick, I think what Bitcoin does that's so powerful for a lot of people is help convince them that the state is not their God. The institution all throughout history, like go back and look at the church, right? When the church was in charge, it wasn't about God or like the idea of God so much as it was about the institution was God, right? The all ultimate sovereign. And in our society today, the institution is the ultimate sovereign, right? Trust the science, trust the legislators. They have your best interest at heart. And I think that is a very powerful delusion, and it's very difficult to disrupt. And Bitcoin is just sort of a peek behind the curtain, because it's like, hey, the institution hates Bitcoin, but it keeps going up and everyone's getting stupid rich and you're not. What's up with that? And it's so small and it's so powerful, kind of like, that website that I made, that it's just like, it's just so simple. And you look at it and you're like, huh.
Don't overthink it.
Why are things like this? Like, could they be wrong? Maybe, I don't know. And I know, I can't speak to you guys, and I know plenty of Bitcoiners don't believe in God, and I'm perfectly fine with having conversations with people that I disagree with, but I do. And I think that there's a natural order. And I think that the natural order, when it's defied, I think that there's consequences, and we have a tendency to defy that natural order. And it always has consequences. And we're just, like you said, reaping what we've sown.
Yeah. I think, to go back to the question about like, excuse me, is there a point like in articulating these things explicitly if we're always kind of subject to power dynamics and the nature and state of technology? And after listening to both you speak, and because you can be somewhat cynical about it, but I think that the exploration of thought in order to try to find truth, right? And maybe we'll never find truth, capital T, but like to try to refine the clarity of our perception that we engage reality with, I think is useful for probably many reasons. But in the context of this discussion, is because I think it can ignite or inspire you to seek solutions that that make that more real. So if nobody ever talked about, if Bastiat never wrote this, because like, well, what the fuck's the difference? Like, shit's going to happen the way it's going to happen. I have no power here. The momentum of history is what it is. What's the point? But I think that people who are trying to see with clarity, articulating what they're seeing and how they're looking at it, has that propensity and has the possibility of igniting something in someone that says, you know what, that's right. And I want to try to bring that further into reality. And, who knows what Satoshi's motivations were, but we know some of them from his writings and, even what he put in the Genesis block, that he understood that there was a problem here, and on ideological, political, economic, all sorts of grounds. And he was sufficiently inspired to design a solution. So I think that's, as cynical as we might sometimes be able to be by just throwing up our hands and saying, there's a momentum to history, how can we stop it? But I think even conversations like this, I mean, you could say, what's the point of having these conversations? But I think the fact that they can help people clarify their thinking, and that can ignite or inspire them to either pursue that and continue refining it, or to look towards solutions to bringing what they believe to be true and right and useful and good into the real world, as it were, into their lives, and actually leverage that to establish more freedom, more liberty, more prosperity, more peace. I mean, I think that's kind of the point of having those moral or religious or ideological or philosophical discussions, to kind of determine what you're orienting, what's going to orient you in terms of what inspirations are going to pull you forward. How are you going to devote your energy and your attention and your focus? What are you going to try to create with the energy at your disposal or the resources at your disposal? And I think that's why these higher level conversations about religion and God and spirituality are important, because ultimately those are some of the things that pull us forward the most and dictate what we're going to try to create in this world and make of this world. But another point that was brought up was just how, first of all, I don't think people realize just how, like, when you read this book and you're like, the government should be the organization of collective force in order to preserve liberty of the individual. How far have we departed from that? Like, just look at what the government does today, all the different taxes there are, all the different departments and education, and it's in every part of our life. And as Colin, as you said, and there is a great parallel here to the the Middle Ages and the institution of the church, is that really has become God. That's the thing that determines everything, right? That's the whole
omnipresent. It's omniscient.
Exactly. Yeah. And people contend with that, and they also abdicate so much, not just responsibility for doing things, but they abdicate morality in many ways to it. And actually, Bastiat has a great line in this book, and he says, when law and morality are in contradiction to each other, the citizen finds himself in the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or of losing his respect for the law, two evils of equal magnitude between which it would be difficult to choose. And I think you can make a strong case that one is perverting the other in the worst possible ways as a result of just how all-encompassing and how omnipresent and how powerful the state has become. And so, you guys can comment on any of that if you like, but one question I'd like to ask you is that idea of basically the primary reason why we would collectively organize is to preserve our individual safety, effectively using collective force to preserve individual safety and liberty. How can that not be co-opted, even if let's say we're in a Bitcoin world, but there's still the element of coercion. I can agree or accept that the logic of plunder or violence has changed to some degree, right? It's not so easy. You can't just knock someone over the head and take their gold, because maybe their gold is in their head and they have to be complicit in it. But still, power and violence and force obviously has the ability to coerce. How do you guys see, if we can shrink down to that level of collective organization from the, where we are now, how do you see that being parameterized, or how do you contained in that function and not being co-opted as has always been the case?
I think Bastiat kind of hits on this, which is it's the importance of this re-education of what the state is or can be, right? So we look at the state as it can provide or should provide everything, and it should prevent all ills, or can prevent all ills. And I think that Bitcoin can be that force for re-education of like, that's not the role of the state, and it shouldn't be. And now, because we've taken away the printer, it can't be. I think that is, people love to say that Bitcoin fixes this or fixes everything or whatever. Bitcoin doesn't fix everything, but just like everything else, it is the shifts at the edges that change the narrative and eventually change the way that our world or our lives operate. Right? It's these what seem like little things that we can twist. Small percentages on the end. What percentage of the world of Bitcoiners right now? Right? Like real Bitcoiners, not just own Bitcoin, but like really get it and understand it and believe in it to a level that changes them. It's a small fraction,
Tiny.
a small fraction, a small fraction. But what could be done? It's a powerful, and I think that's the thing I keep getting from Bastiat, is this powerful switch in that small percentage, which then becomes a larger percentage and then becomes a larger percentage, which is this change in the narrative of something that libertarians have believed for a long time, and which is just that idea that it's not the state's job. It's not the government's job. They're not capable of solving all of these problems. And Colin talked about the religion and now the state. If you look back in history, the tallest structures in the world generally coincide with the most powerful entities in that space, right? So you go back to the pyramids and the pharaohs, so you have sort of the gods there, and then you have in the Roman Empire, you have the state, and then you have churches, and then you have the Washington Monument and government, and then you have banks that are the tallest buildings in the world, and now oil is the tallest building in the world. And so these things also coincide with what become our God in a lot of ways. What becomes the thing that controls our society. And I guess I see that nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to flip the entire world the way that we know it, but it is those small changes at the edges that do make a big difference over time. We may not see this re-education happen in our lifetimes, but it is the germination of a beginning idea that can re-educate over a generation, that can bring a new idea of that's not the state's job. And I think that is a powerful thing that Bitcoin can bring, which is that's not the state's job. That is no longer, not only is it not their job, but it can't be their job. Don't trust, verify is a powerful sense that there is no trust. It's not available, right? So in Bitcoin, printing more Bitcoin is not possible. It's not just that somebody is trusted not to do it. It is not possible. And so with that comes this idea of let's make these things that we don't want to happen in the world, not just we're going to trust somebody to not do it, a benevolent dictator, if you will, the Marcus Aurelius of the world. We're going to not make it possible. And it will no longer be in the state's arena to make it possible. And I think that really can have a huge effect and will have a huge effect. So that's again, I think as powerful as the tool is, I think that education piece and the community around it may have just as large an impact in the greater scheme of things as we move more and more towards this inevitable Bitcoin world where, what we used to take for granted. And I love the example of like the PhDs of communist economics in Russia, the completely made up science or science of thought. that just went away when communist Russia fell apart, when USSR fell apart. And I think we may look at things like Keynesian economics in the same way under a Bitcoin world of like, remember we used to think that that was crazy. I can't believe that was how we used to believe, or what an idiosyncratic thing that the people of the 1900s and the early 2000s believed, that, this broken window theory, these Keynesian economics, or we can just print our way out of problems. Thank God we have this, now we have this Bitcoin thing. I think that people may look at MMT or Keynesian economics the same way we used to look at bloodletting, right? Or some other medical procedure that we now look at as dangerous and silly and unnecessary. And it's that technology that's going to sort of allow that to exist.
I think it's worth considering. I love what you just mentioned about the communist economic PhDs. It's worth considering that, like, these fiat academics is what I like to call them, because if you break down the word fiat into what it actually means, and so few people today understand this, they think fiat just means not backed by anything, but fiat means by decree. Fiat is a declaration that this is how it is. So all of these fiat academics who have been certified or classified as experts in a particular field by decree, by the state, by whatever governing authority gives them that power, who have these terrible, silly ideas that are destructive and useless for society or just flat out wrong. You got to think, when the power structure that makes that fiat, makes that declaration, when that power structure collapses, well, that declaration is gone, right? And that's exactly what you saw with the communist PhDs. It's like, well, the authority that made that declaration no longer exists. So what are you? Nothing. You're just like the rest of us. I want to. Oh, and this is another thing that you were saying. Bastiat talks about this too in the book. He says that the state should not be focused on promoting justice, but rather should be focusing on preventing injustice. And this gets into this concept of negative and positive rights. To give somebody a positive right, you have to take something from someone else to give it to them. But negative rights is just this prevention of theft of one's wealth, this promotion of liberty and private property and free speech and those types of things, whereas opposed with, taking and giving, or taking and redistributing. And I totally agree with Bastiat there, but there's my favorite Mises quote from Human Action. I think you guys would both really like. It's the flourishing of human society ultimately depends on two factors. One, the ability of outstanding intellectual men to conceive sound social and economic theories. And two, the ability of those men or other men to make those ideas palatable to the majority.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we were discussing before with the utility of articulating explicitly some of these ideas and philosophies, right? And kind of putting them in the public domain to do battle, right? Have these ideas do battle, and then leave it to each individual to be inspired by whatever particular aspect of them that they are, to try to amplify it or create it in the real world, right?
That's really what Bitcoin does. I mean, Bitcoin does a lot of things, so we like to speak in absolutes, but one of the things that Bitcoin does is it makes that ideology so much more palatable to the masses, right? Because now you don't have to read Human Action. You just got to buy Bitcoin because number go up, like Orange Coin good.
Right. And it has embodied in it so many of those principles, right? That's the magic of it. And so there's two things I wanted to touch on. One was, we talk about fiat economists, and John, you were mentioning your buddy, your white whale who you want to try to orange pill, but he just can't get it. And, Bastiat, as prescient as ever, touches on this in a bit more of a narrow scope, but he says, if you lecture upon morality or political economy, official bodies will be found to make this request to the government, that henceforth science be taught not only with sole reference to free exchange, to liberty, property, and justice, as has been the case up to the present time, but also and especially with reference to the facts and legislation contrary to liberty, property, and justice that regulate French industry, that in public lecterns salaried by the Treasury, the professor abstain rigorously from endangering in the slightest degree the respect due to the laws now in force, which, to my mind is an allusion to the fact that if you're let's say a fiat economist, if you're brought up on the fiat education, if you're suckling the fiat teat because you work at a, an institution that is either directly or in a roundabout way funded by the money or the ideologies of the dominant organizing mechanism, i.e. the state, then your incentives aren't to go against that, right? Your incentives aren't to introduce new ways of thinking about things. Your incentives are to play that game, right? And so that's why so many people are so rigidly adhere to that, because it's in their best interest to do that. Why rock the boat? It doesn't serve you whatsoever. And John, what you were mentioning about Bitcoin and changing people. I mean, I love to discuss this topic on my podcast. I think it's the most fascinating aspect of what's going on. It gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And this goes to what Colin was just saying too. Like, I don't have much hope that I can force, the world to read 100 books on liberty, economics, and philosophy, and they'll just really get it. But you start owning Bitcoin, taking custody of your Bitcoin, like really owning it. And it just starts to transform people, it seems. And like, not exclusively, I don't want to overdo it. Like, yes, the fact that you end up, you buy Bitcoin, you own Bitcoin, then you start paying attention to Bitcoin things. Then you start maybe being on Twitter or being more attuned to seeing Bitcoin articles out in the wild, and maybe you read them. And so there's an element of being influenced by all the goings on in Bitcoin land exterior to you. But I still think there's something like transcendental or transformative about owning Bitcoin for yourself and kind of knowing that, like, hey, I have this ultimate form of optionality that like nobody can intermediate, that like only I control, and that I can deploy to do a great many things with my stored capital, let's say. And I think that's a really unique feeling, sensation that people, especially once you start interacting with the network and learning about it more, it has a transformative effect on people. And then, as John was saying, like, you start reading more and you start making these small changes, almost subconsciously at first, and then maybe it ramps up and they're more conscious. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, like, liberty, as Bastiat describes it, or we can say sovereignty or freedom, combined with a hope that it's possible, and all the different images that flood your mind about what encompasses that hope based on what your understanding of Bitcoin, let's say, let me reword that. Your understanding of Bitcoin engenders a certain type of hope, and then your kind of imagination runs wild with all the different imagery associated with that. But I think freedom and hope, those two things are like insanely powerful sensations or drivers of behavior. And once you have those two things, not only do you want to amplify them and continue to understand why they even occurred within you, why they sprung up, how you generated them, but I think you want to try to naturally foster more of, or align yourself more with the what you think is going to be. Well, you play to your incentives once again. Maybe that's the punchline, right? The fiat economist is playing to their incentives. But if you see this new system, if you see this new power, this new tool, and this new future on the horizon, maybe it's all just about playing to your greater incentives. Your time preference is lower. You stack more sats. You don't spend it on booze. You make sure you're going to be healthy for that future that you envision. All this stuff is wrapped up in it. And I just find it so fascinating. And my point in saying all this is that getting people to read a bunch of stuff and change is almost impossible. But I'm encouraged by seeing the extent of this transformation that is almost across the board. I mean, it has obviously, slight differences, but John, like, when you were saying how you had changed over the past 3 years as a result of coming into this, like, I've heard that story a lot. And that gives me so much hope, because one, number go up is such a powerful method of getting people in. And then once they come in to start being transformed in that way, that gives me hope that the process can accelerate. And I think we're just at the very, very beginning of this. And the more that we feed into it, I think the more surface area this thing has for people to latch onto, of people of different walks of life, different interests, different backgrounds, all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think it's freedom and hope are very powerful motivators.
I think every halving you're bringing a new factor, like regardless of what we say, the halvings are going to bring in a new quorum of people every time, right? It's just
Yeah.
it's going to happen, and whether they get it right away or it takes them a few years, whatever. There are people who own Bitcoin out there who don't talk about it all day, like psychopaths. I don't know who they are, who owns Bitcoin and doesn't talk about it all day, but I don't know what's wrong with them. Get on my level. But it's my brothers are great examples. I badgered all of them into buying Bitcoin. None of them, really have gotten to this. I should say not. One of them has depth. I can see the change in him. I can feel it.
You just got to give that time. Once it hits $1 million, I think they'll be a little bit more.
Right. I mean, they're paying attention. They're excited about the price, but they're not.
I know.
They're not reading Bastiat. They're not reading what I got. I got Mises over here. I got Subsovereign Individual. I just finished. So that I read for a couple times now, and I think that is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Right. Like whatever it's just this great dichotomy of like the tool is so important. Bitcoin itself is so important. It doesn't need us at all. But at the same time, and watching a Clubhouse is a crazy place to be, just because you see there's so much reinforcement of the ideals that the Bitcoin community has been trying to push over and over and over again. And now it's being done in real time. And you're watching people come in and be like, oh, I've got Nano, or I've got, these other cryptocurrencies, and it's being snuffed out almost immediately. Like, no, it's like a spray bottle and your cat jumping on the counter. Like,
that's because HODL and Bitcoin Tina, they're abusing everybody who comes on.
I know NBK and Bitcoin Tina. I can't get in. Sometimes I got to turn the room off because I can't hear about the lost monetary premium of gold one more time before I just lose my mind. But I did want to mention, so because you're here, Colin, the 19th Nixon, I think, is and any libertarian may have watched Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia about psychedelic drugs and the misconceptions, and you can't watch that and not have this sense of like, what are we missing, right? And so the Controlled Substance Abuse Act of 1970 is not something that we talk a lot about in the Bitcoin community, but I think it is almost as, I won't say as powerful as 1971 in terms of what we've done to the money, but you're talking about essentially banning amateur chemistry, right? And so in the book, Bastiat says, now, by what action can society give to every person the necessary education and necessary tools of production, if not by the action of the state? So this idea that the state is responsible for giving you the tools and educating you. I think that comes from like this sort of elite guilt, right? So people who've made it, in a lot of societies, there's these people who have benefited from the state, and now they have this guilt of like, well, we want to bring everybody else up, right? The benevolent dictators, the benevolent, the quote unquote good legislators, they have this idea that like, well, I made it, I got educated, the system worked for me, but I have this guilt that like it didn't work for everybody. So how do I get everybody? So we'll educate them the same way I was educated. We'll teach them the same things. We'll try to give them the rules, and in doing so, they end up redistributing wealth, creating more problems than they solve. You look at China in the 1980s, and there's a term in economics, 101 stuff, which is the PPR, right, or the PBC, which is the production possibilities curve, right? So the society lives on this production possibilities curve. When the state gets involved, it can move you away from that perfect level of economy where the supply and demand crosses, right? You can get away from that when the state gets involved and says, this group is going to make rice, and this group is going to make wood, and this group is, whatever it may be. And you end up creating inefficiencies, right? And so the market creates the most efficient ways for goods and services to be provided for the state. And you look at, something like the Controlled Substances Act, and the state has said, okay, we're going to provide you with tools, we're going to provide you with education, but wait, the 1960s counterculture was dangerous. We don't like what happened to the people who did acid or the people who did psychedelic drugs. We don't like what we did to the free love movement in the 1960s. So not only are we going to ban those substances, but we're also going to ban basic amateur chemistry, to the point where in 2019 you couldn't buy basic chemistry glassware in the state of Texas, a state that we think of as this sort of home of the free. Until 2019, you couldn't buy basic chemistry sets there. And I think about the loss of independent thought and independent creativity. I mean, imagine if we had banned C++, right? Imagine if we had banned computer keyboards because the state had deemed that they were a danger. All the things that we have lost, and then you expand that across the history of the world, and all the things that states or governments had banned because they were educated in such a way that they thought this was correct. Think about all of the inefficiencies created by that, and that's when it really starts to hit home of like how much unintended dangerous consequences can come from people who think they know better. Give me a state of liberty. Give me a state where you can pursue your thoughts and ideas in a way that allows for creativity and things to be provided. If the United States, and we talk about things like this in Bitcoin all the time. I think the Red Flag Act in the UK in the early days of the car is a perfect example of you have the UK should for all intents and purposes should have been the leader of creating new cars in the world. They were the leader in the Industrial Revolution. They had the ability, they had the money. And what happens? Legislators come along and they say that car is dangerous. We're going to create this thing called the Red Flag Act. It requires 3 people to operate a vehicle, 1 person to drive it, an engineer to be in the car with him to make sure everything's going well, and a 3rd guy to walk in front of the car by 100 yards or 100 meters and make sure that nobody gets run over. And so what happens? The US doesn't make those laws. Ford comes along and creates a new way of manufacturing, and the US is off to the races and becomes the world leader in vehicles. I think about that in the 1970s Controlled Substances Act with chemistry. I mean, think about all the brilliant people who just wanted to tinker, people who just thought chemistry was cool. They had no other, and how many of those people we lost because they couldn't get into the basic science. And the state has basically said, unless you have a PhD or you are in a university program, we are not going to give you access to the kind of things that will make your job interesting. And so they go and do something else with their time. And then you look at the way that we've incentivized everything. You look at the brilliant people who end up working in financial services because that's where the money is, instead of pursuing their passions of astrophysics or chemistry or whatever it might be. You end up with, well, I could figure out a way using my advanced mathematical degrees in education and interest. I can find, instead of doing that, I can go work for a hedge fund, and I figured out a way to tweak their algorithm and make them an extra 0.1%, which actually will equal millions of dollars or billions of dollars for them, millions of dollars for me. So instead of using my massive intellect and curiosity to do something that's interesting for the world, I'm going to go and make 0.1% more. And I think the Bitcoin, and this is probably the thing I'm most excited about with Bitcoin, is that it will free up people from having to do those kinds of jobs, because the number go up technology and just the if you hold some Bitcoin, it gives you freedom and hope, right? So now I'm into astrophysics when I'm in high school, and I'm not so worried about making that extra $1 million because I have Bitcoin and I feel comfortable in that sense of freedom and hope. Well, now I can go and figure out how we're going to land people on Mars, or I can study, the results off the Hadron Collider and decide that, I've learned something new about quantum physics that changes our whole understanding of the universe. We're so in the nascent stages of that, and it will free up so much mental energy of the world, of the entire world. People who are focused on this nothing of making money, right? This nothing of, I need to pay my paycheck. I need to, get my mortgage on. I'm sorry. Next time I'll figure out how to turn my notifications off. That mental capital that is locked in a fiat system can be released under this new system, and man can have hope and freedom. And I think you put it so well, John. I think that hope and freedom is what Bitcoin gives us. And I think, like you said, I think Bastiat would see what's happening in the world right now and be extremely excited about the possibilities of what we are unleashing through this technology.
I can definitely speak to what you're saying there personally. Like, I know when I was younger, I've always had a huge affinity and fascination for science, natural sciences in particular. But how do you work in that field? Well, you have to get a PhD, or you have to go to medical school. And if you look at the structure of the way that those types of careers are set up, well, the next 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of your life are going to involve a lot of debt and a lot of slave labor. And you better just get used to it, because that's the way it is and there's no other path. And that I know for me, like, that completely turned me off. Like, at one point in my life, I wanted to go into the medical field, and I took one look at it and said, no, I don't think so. And then other points, I would like, oh, I'd love to be a chemist. No, never mind. I don't want to do that. And really, the only place you can find, fortunately, still that type of fostering of creative energy in a logical natural science is in computer programming. It's really the only place it still exists, because there's no academic gatekeeping.
Yeah, I think beyond, let's say, the tragedies that arise from the application of force by the state, so i.e. war, to my mind, it seems like the suppressant on the human spirit that arises from basically the central dictating of the parameters of society and the incentives that are constructed from that. So basically, like, when you have such a top-down system, the ideologies or the incentives or the values or what have you of the people at the top of that system is what sets the parameters for everyone below. And an easy example is, John, one you gave, is just like of laws, right? Like, if we say messing around with psychedelic substances is not permitted, well, that funnels people away from that and towards something else. And like, there are probably infinite examples of how the structure of the governance systems that we have, predicated on the money, have parameterized human action and restricted human action to a massive degree, which is forced people to, and Colin, your case is a perfect example. It's forced human beings, when they're making decisions, to say, oh, that road is not available to me. I have to go, this road is the one that's been set out for me, but I don't really like how that road is set out. I'd rather go down the one that, the other one, but it's not set up for that. You can't make you can't make ends meet, or it really morphs the system. And what I feel that does is, like, as your example, it shows, like, you had an inward desire to explore whatever, like the natural world or the natural sciences, but because of the way the system was structured, you were turned away from that. And how many instances are there of people being turned away from their natural impulse, their natural curiosity, their natural values or principles or whatever, because what they were perceiving out in the broader world, the quote unquote system that had been constructed along the lines that we've been discussing, had closed a lot of those doors, right? Like, what does that do to the human spirit? And I think what it does, well, I think it acts as a huge suppressant on the human spirit. And I think that is, again, apart from war, the biggest tragedy of all this, because when you squash or inhibit the human spirit like that, I think you get a lot of the things that we're seeing today: a lot of frustration, a lot of despair, a lot of substance abuse, a lot of mental health issues, a lot of violence. Ultimately, that erupts in all this erupts in different ways. But I think when you continue to contract the space around the individual, right, when their freedom of of how they can choose to act in the world is restricted and restricted and restricted and restricted, there's a tremendous frustration that arises from that, whether or not it's consciously or subconsciously understood. And I think part of the dynamic of this recurring process of history, which John, as you said, Brandon kind of explores in his writing about the fourth turning, is that it gets so bad, and a lot of people get destroyed by it. And there's so many examples that we could point to in today's world that would be examples of that. But it also forces the refinement of the people who aren't going to be destroyed by it, right? So these tumultuous times in history are completely devastating for a lot of people, but they also end up showcasing the examples of individuals throughout history that we now look to as kind of we hold them up as for the principles they espoused, or for the virtues, or for the values that they embodied, that they were forced to express more than they otherwise might have, because the circumstances dictated that they had to make a choice between acquiescing to the restrictive or suppressing effects of their current environment, or resisting it and actually revealing those things that are most true about themselves, right? And you could roughly characterize this as being the kind of story of the martyr, right? Who, despite the circumstance, despite the tragedy or the difficulty of the circumstance, maintains that core essence of truth or virtue or value or principle about themselves. And again, that is, as we've all been saying, that is such one of the reasons for such excitement, because I think out of this current time, which, I mean, look, with people, you mentioned Ilhan Omar recently, like, we're asking the government to cancel and pay for rents. We're asking them to, get involved in wages. Like it's such a leviathan at this point that's restricted, human individual decision-making and responsibility to such a massive degree. And then we have certain cohorts of people, I think the Bitcoiners chief among them, that are being led by this freedom and hope that they can now access and see. And I think that's inspiring them tremendously, but it's also causing us to refine and kind of like cut away the fat of our personalities and our characters, and cause us to contemplate and develop more our own philosophies and ideologies of what we truly are about. What are the things that are most valuable to us? Health, family, curiosity, play, fun, fill in the blank. I'm not imposing any of that, but it seems to be a trend that the juxtaposition of the circumstance we're in with now the new emerging possibility that we're perceiving is facilitating that process. And so, I'm simultaneously horrified at just how invisible, but how influential the current structure has been on, the human spirit, but also, so excited by what this change represented in Bitcoin is, or what this new paradigm represented in Bitcoin is fostering in terms of the reemergence and the rejuvenation of the human spirit, which, I see in Bitcoiners. I see a revivified everything, curiosity, hope, freedom, interaction, connection, all of that. I mean, and it's exploding. It's like dripping from we're sweating it all out. And so, I couldn't be more hopeful about that. But I do think I just wanted to elaborate on that point about how much the restriction of having someone dictate in a centralized system their own values and principles, et cetera, and having it forcefully applied to everyone, how much that constrains and negatively influences, the human spirit of the individual.
Yeah, I found, so, I don't know how much time you guys have. I could do this all day, honestly.
I'm good.
To tie that back to Bitcoin, this is sometimes, narratives can kind of come up and then go away, and come up and go away sometimes in Bitcoin. And when I first came in, the conversation was always, bank the unbanked, and remittances were like that was sort of something that really intrigued me, because I've done 2 tours in Afghanistan. I saw what abject poverty looked like. I saw what not having access to both the internet and information, and also the access to to a banking system or to a reliable currency does to people. And to tie what you were saying, John, back to Bitcoin, there may, so there are people who don't go after the things they would want to go after because of the limitations of the system. But there are also people who, the greatest entrepreneur in the world may live in a part of the world that just doesn't have the access, and will never have the access. And Bitcoin removes all those barriers in one fell swoop. And so the combination of the internet with the internet of money, I think is can't be understated, the power that it can bring to those people of the world that we, in our heart of hearts, or in our greatest aspirations, look to help. I think the world is flat. This idea that the world is flattening, and it certainly has been slowly flattened by the internet and access to it. And now there was this missing piece, right? And Bitcoin is that missing piece of flattening access and opportunity. And I find that to be just, such a force for good, and such a possible force for good. And people, when I talk to people who are just getting into Bitcoin, they're like, well, what about the other people in the world who don't have access to this? And I'm like, well, okay, let's look at, Nigeria, for instance. I think 32% of Nigerians now own Bitcoin. So if you think this is a Western adoption, this is, a bunch of tech bros from Silicon Valley. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of that, but there are people in the world, there are people who are interested in this because they have libertarian ideals, or they have an open mind, or they see the problems in the world and they want to get in front of it. But then there are people in the world who need it right now, and they're using it in that way right now. And I think that narrative gets lost. And I hope that we continue to see adoption in that way, giving people who don't have access the same sort of life raft, or the same arc that we are preaching about, talking about, discussing all the time. And I say that because of that first person experience. I did probably the most powerful experience as a Marine was, so I'm a C-130 pilot. I fly big cargo planes. And usually we're doing refueling or we're doing logistics. But in 2013, we had Typhoon Haiyan, which wiped out southern part of the Philippines. And we went there to do humanitarian aid relief, and seeing, so being a part of that operation, being a part of, that force for good that we felt, we were doing there. But then at the same time, seeing the level of, the lack of access to the things that we take for granted, was a really powerful moment for me. And then again, deploying to Afghanistan and seeing it again in first person, of the lack of, you have a population that is illiterate to the point of, I think 75, 80% in the southern parts of Afghanistan. And if you can combine those things together, you can give access to these people that would otherwise not have it. And they are the ones that I think they're the ones that will adopt it faster than people that I talk to on a daily basis, who are like, oh, I heard Bitcoin's doing well. Like, that's cool. I don't really need it. I've got a bank. I got Venmo, right? I've got a bank account. I got a Chase account. I got a credit card. I hope that the actual requirement to adopt it outpaces those who don't see it for what it is and just assume, well, I've got fintech, so I don't need Bitcoin, and don't understand the fundamental difference between the two. Yeah.
I got a question, and it's obviously a bit personal, so you can feel free to not answer it.
Sure.
But this conversation centers around what Bastiat thought was the primary raison d'etre, the primary use of law, which is to bring together collective force in order to preserve individual liberty. And prevent injustice. And Bitcoiners, we've been discussing a lot what some of the philosophies that Bitcoiners tend to have. How do you square, being a part of the instrument of the apparatus of force for this big, Leviathan state that we've been largely criticizing throughout this conversation,
yeah,
with, some of the philosophies that may have been amplified in you since coming into Bitcoin, or along the lines of what we discussed? Like, I'd just be interested in hearing how you square, what you do with some of the things you've been saying.
There's certainly there's always needs to be a separation between the warrior and the state, or the military member and the state and the philosophy behind that. People join the military for all kinds of reasons, right? And some of those are incentives because, maybe you're joining because of its education, or you want a benefit that has nothing to do with military service or what the military does. It is something that is, it is an interesting process to go through while I'm still serving. And I am still wrestling with those thoughts. But, I do think, and he does say the function of law is to protect the free exercise of these rights and to prevent any person from interfering with the free exercise of these same rights by any other person. In a global state, where does that is one question I actually had about, as I was reading about Bastiat and how he would look at the world today. Sometimes that is an easier thing to discern on a local level, or at least you think the state can control on a local level. But when you're talking about global threats, whether that be terrorism or a nation state, where does that military stop, right? So if you think that a Taliban-like attack of 9/11 or something other than that is possible, does the military stop at we're going to retaliate when things happen, or do you take more of a George W. Bush type approach of we're going to go out there and root out the evil and stop it before it can raise its head? And I do think, I think that Bastiat talks about it, right? The existence of persons and property precede the existence of the legislator, and his function is only to guarantee their safety. Well, where does that guarantee stop and start? And I think that there are uses of military that are required for a state on a global stage. So there a lot of Bitcoiners will say, well, we don't, the military is not something we need, or it is the military that protects the fiat system. And I think that what gets lost in there is the protection that the military provides to the individual or to the people of that state. And so I think there is a place for national defense in the world, in a Bitcoin world. I just think that we have overstepped that in the current fiat world.
Yeah, I think, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's hard to parse out. It's always hard to isolate certain things when they're in such a broader, like you mentioned George W. Bush saying, like, well, is there a preemptive element to defense? But then the question is like, well, yeah, but how much did you contribute to the thing that you're preemptively defending against, right? And so, that's why I asked to get your thoughts, because like we've been saying, defense is always going to be, or perhaps is the primary component of the law. But, it seems like it's become, like everything, so perverted and so overused and so exacerbated that been abused.
Breedlove talked a little bit about this. I forget where I was listening to it, which is sort of that idea of the fiat system. It takes what would normally be, so it takes away the requirement of consent from the populace, right? So in a Bitcoin world, could we still have a military? Could we still have a unit for defense? Yeah, but it would require permission. And right now we don't require permission. I think that's the fundamental difference. And that's the change I would like to see, right? So there is no requirement for permission of like, hey, should we build, 10 bill, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of F-35s? Is that something that we need as a nation? When there's no permission required, then yeah, we'll build them until the next idea comes out, and then we'll spend more money and build those. And so you take away the requirement for efficient use of capital. And and I think even in a world of COVID, however you feel about COVID, maybe there's a world in which we say, hey, we're going to raise taxes by 0.1% this year because it'll help the entire populace. It'll benefit the entire populace. But again, it's required permission, and that's what we've lost in a fiat system. Is there is no requirement for permission or asking the governed or asking the people for how we want to do that. And if you outstep that in a Bitcoin world, then your government fails and the system will turn to something else. Whereas now you can make mistakes forever and you can just print over them and print over them and print over them, as we see time and time and time again. And I think that's the difference that I hope to see. Now, it's so hard. I feel like for me, at least, as I'm still sort of grasping, is like, what does the hyper Bitcoinization world really look like? Is there no more nation state? Is there no more government? Is there, are we all in cyberspace? Do we become interplanetary? I don't know. It's something I'm still grasping with. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. How that world looks. But I'm listening to the conversations, and I'm still trying to understand, or I'm still trying to form my own thoughts on what exactly that world looks like.
I would ask if you've ever read any Rothbard, John.
Yeah, I do have. I have read some Rothbard for sure.
Yeah, because it's like you said, these aren't easy topics to wrestle with. For New Liberty and Anatomy of the State are probably some of the most profound works of literature ever written, if I had to say so myself. And likewise, with The Road to Serfdom, I certainly understand your contentions, but I don't know. I know for me personally, I feel like the more I dive into these things, and you can see other John has Sovereign Individual back there behind him on the table. That's another book that I've recently gone through. And I had kind of been putting that one off because it was kind of exactly what I expected it to be, but I enjoyed it more than I thought I would because it had so much history in it, and I love history. But it kind of basically just rehashes a lot of the things that Rothbard talks about in what a truly free market society or an anarcho-capitalist society looks like, and how it functions, and how it doesn't just collapse into chaos and destruction, and how it could actually potentially be better in a lot of ways. And there's nuance too, and it is complicated. I talked earlier about the Barbary Coast Wars. In that environment, there wasn't a solution readily available to solve the problem other than state force brought to bear to protect the free flow of commerce on the international waters. And if I had been in Thomas Jefferson's shoes, I don't know that I would have seen a different solution to that either. So much of it is theoretical, right? Because we've never truly seen some of the things that we're talking about, and certainly this paradigm shift is unprecedented. It's uncomfortable to wrestle with the idea that perhaps the world as I know it today may not exist in 10 or 20 years. But it's certainly a possibility. I can't say with certainty, that there will be no more nation states. But it, certainly seems that is a possibility, especially as they are printing themselves into irrelevance. It's so powerful, this disruption of status quo, this disruption of established order. And this established order that is going so far against the grain of what I call the natural order, right? What we were talking about earlier, like the system of inputs and outputs and the consequences that they yield. I don't know, man. I think the state's days are numbered, but that's just me personally.
Yeah, I think, as we've been discussing, the money is probably the primary determinant of what the governance system looks like, broadly defined. And I think our governance system right now, in practice, not in theory, but in practice, we have there's not chaos on the streets. There's something to be said for that, of course, right? But it's metastasized to something, truly, cancerous to the host, in my opinion, and has a lot of problems. I think when a system becomes predicated on something else, we're going to see something vastly different, and it's going to be in line with the permissions and prohibitions that thing, i.e. the money, i.e. Bitcoin, fosters or has within it, and the things that grow on top of that as a result. And so, I don't like to get too. We can only speculate about what a transition might be like and how messy it'll be and blah blah blah. But I think in the future, we probably see smaller organizations, like a fracturing of jurisdictions of some kind. And I think we'll see the kind of jurisdictional competition that the sovereign individual anticipates. It's hard for me to imagine that, a year from now, let's say, or 2 years from now, Bitcoin's $10 trillion market cap, or on its way to $100 trillion market cap. And there's a lot of freedom-loving people around the world that are looking to get out of, places that are imposing less or are restricting freedoms from them. It's hard for me to imagine that jurisdictions don't start popping up saying, "Hey, look, we don't have much power or control over the nature of things anyway. So you can have as much freedom as you want. Just come here with your IP and your capital and everything else, and do your thing." And I feel like once that ball gets rolling, it'll probably heat up, and hopefully that competition will mean more freedoms and better living circumstances, and that'll put pressure on other places. But too many variables to know. So I think as with maybe the individual life, is like the best way to guide forward is to try to discern what you think is the most valuable use of your time and the behavior that's most in line with your values and principles, and pursue that path and see what opens up in front of you. And I think if we all do that, we'll probably end up in a good place. But like Colin said, we're in a time of extreme change. And even with COVID, my perspective was, we all know this evolving technology narrative, right? We're in, the singularity, whatever you want to call it. Like we've always known that in our lifetimes, technology has been evolving extremely rapidly, and that's obvious. But I think we also kind of felt that we were in a historical period of things are going to more or less stay the same or be stable. Like, yes, we'll have cooler gadgets, but we're talking about France in the late 18th century, early 19th century. There was a lot of chaos and change and carnage and all sorts of shit going on there. And I don't know, I felt like I never really thought that we would see that type of change. But with the forces at play now, and especially things that have been going on since the pandemic hit, you're starting to get that feeling that we probably won't enjoy as quote unquote calm and a generation as our parents, the baby boomer generation. I think we may be in one of those generations of extreme change. And I think this may be just the start of it. And we have a phenomenal tool to help facilitate and guide that change in a way that is hopefully positive. But no change comes without disruption, right? That's the whole point of it. And disruption can be extremely uncomfortable for people that are resistant to it or not prepared for it or what have you. So, I don't know where we're going, but I'm hoping that the tools of sovereignty at our disposal are greater than ever. And I think it's just incumbent upon us to leverage those and use them to optimal effect, to establish those things in our own lives, to permit us to be the people, permit us to be the people that we believe we are and we can be, back to that idea of kind of suppressing the human spirit, and hoping that more and more people doing that results in more positive outcomes for the world.
I would add too that the state, by its nature, like, because you were talking about how part of the problem with our defense complex is, it's coercive, it's non-voluntary. I don't get to choose whether or not Biden bombs Syria, and a less coercive system would be preferable and might evolve out of Bitcoin, because the state loses its ability to just fund non-profitable endeavors. Essentially what you're describing there is a more free market system, where if you don't like this, you go to that, and all participation is voluntary, because if they don't get your money from you, you don't take their service and they go out of business. Really, a state sovereign, by its fundamental nature, is coercive, because if it's not coercive, it really sort of ceases to function. And when you break down like that, like, because if a state sovereign is not coercive, what can it do? It can't do anything if it's not coercive, if it's not mandatory.
If it's not going against market forces, what's the point of it?
Right. Yeah, otherwise, because the state is not an individual. The state doesn't take action. The state doesn't have ends. The state just is comprised of individuals with their own agendas. And the state is a means to those ends. So if the state is non-coercive, well, then that just kind of happens at the individual level.
Yeah. I think that that is probably the thing that I'm reading Sovereign Individual and coming to these things, and really wrestling with this stuff, with these ideas is sort of that last frontier for me and for Bitcoiners in general, of like, okay, so we're working towards creating this new world. What is that going to look like? It doesn't just form itself necessarily, but it can be shaped by the technology that we're creating. And you mentioned the singularity is near, and I think I had a sense as a younger man of like, oh man, I wish I'd lived in this time, or I wish I'd lived in this era, or I wish I'd lived in this decade. And for the first time, really, I'm so excited to be a part of the current simulation, if you will, the current timeline that we're living in, which is, we really are on the cusp of, let's go fucking create whatever we want. Let's go make the world we want it to be. And the book I recommend sometimes for people non-Bitcoin related or not usually sort of spoken of in this in the sphere is Ray Kurzweil's Singularity is Near, 2005. It's a book I read before before the white paper was published, that I think most prepared me for accepting what Bitcoin was and what it was going to be. And just replacing that idea that, we are all linear thinkers, right? Human beings are linear thinkers. It's almost impossible to think in parabolas. But reading Ray Kurzweil primed my brain to look at those parabolas and start trying to think in that way. And so when I came across Bitcoin, I could understand the power of parabolic money, as opposed to sort of this linear thinking of like, yeah, we're just going to continue on this basic line. And now we're in the early stages of as Ray talks about, sort of that knee in the curve, when things start to go vertical. And if you extrapolate that out to our governance and our society, the amount of change we're going to see in the coming years is going to be so rapid that you almost can't you almost can't comprehend it, right? It will happen. It will happen in a way that looking at your small area won't feel like a lot is changing, but when you look back 5-10 years, the whole world will have shifted. And so that's what makes it so difficult to really predict what is that possible world going to look like. And it is important. That's, we talked about earlier, John, the importance of reading, or the importance of thinking about these things. That's where I think these sort of important ideas come in, because the landscape has shifted so fast. We need some kind of, it will be helpful to have some kind of guide of what that world might look like. And this idea of returning to a smaller nation state or a city state or a sovereign individual is a really powerful idea, that we finally have the tools and technology in order to implement that.
Well, that's the interesting conundrum and irony of this situation, because a top-down, centralized, rigid organizational structure like that is very poorly equipped to confront accelerating novelty, right? The accelerating development, as you just articulated. And the irony there is that the more it struggles with adapting to that change, the more restrictive it becomes, the more it attempts to control all that change. And that actually is inverse to its best interest, or it makes it less and less capable of responding to the change rather than more. But it's kind of in its nature to try to solve problems in that way. And this, bringing things full circle, no entity is more capable of adapting to change than the individual. And that line of thinking is not only represented in Bastiat's book, but it's pretty much at the core of all religious and spiritual things, philosophies and truths, perhaps. And we explored this recently on the last book club, but that it is the domain of the individual to mediate the process of, to best mediate the process of change with the order necessary to navigate the world, right? So obviously not everything can be always in flux. You need order for safety and for, to build upon existing knowledge, but you also need to be able to delve into the unknown, into the chaos, into the change, to be able to take out novel and useful information from that and reintegrate it. And that is the domain, of, call it the logos or free will or the individual. And that is definitely not the domain of the state. And the more things accelerate, I think the more that becomes obvious. And I think perhaps that's why we're seeing a change on the individual level, where more and more people are responding, in my opinion, properly to that change. But I think that's also why we're going to have a kind of it's darkest before the dawn scenario, where the amount of change and disruption is only going to exacerbate the flaws and the problems in the existing structure that attempts to control and organize and fail to adapt to that change, which is the state and ultimately its oppressive measures taken in the pursuit of that.
I think there's plenty of examples just in the last decade of things that the state has done because it had to be done, right? We had to bail out the airlines. We had to bail out the banks. And yet now here we are, 12 years later, and there's planes flying through the air with parts falling out of the sky. And everyone's like, man, how does this keep happening? Well, when you say, I guess we didn't learn anything from the Soviets.
Yeah, when you turn everything into a zombie, it's going to start losing toes and legs and ears and stuff, like things decay and they break down. And if they're not able to die and be recycled, then, you're going to get that kind of stuff. And, that's one of the real fundamental components of Bastiat's whole philosophy and everything we've been talking about is, and because we talked about the printing press and we talked about, where's the line of, even from a military perspective, how do you define defense and all this stuff? And it's such a slippery slope, right? Say, oh, it's a crisis, like we have the ability. Does that not mean we have the obligation to help, right? Whether it's a humanitarian crisis outside the border or inside the border, say, look, we know we're here only for the defense of liberty and to preserve justice, but everyone's really suffering right now. And I think we could help. And that is such a slippery slope to go down that road, because it leads to, in my opinion, where we are now. And, the faith underlying Bastiat's philosophy here is in the not only the sovereignty, but the ability and the responsibility of the individual to basically figure shit out for themselves. And as he goes to great lengths, or not great lengths, but he mentions in the book, that doesn't mean like dog eat dog world, everyone fight for themselves. It just means that he has a faith in the individual to make the relationships in their lives, to act as a market participant, to act as a social creature in such a way that manages their own well-being and the well-being of others whom with they're connected, right? It doesn't require the intervention of a supra individual entity to facilitate all that stuff. And in fact, that is ultimately detrimental. So there's a faith there that, like, you have to be okay with what freedom produces. In his opinion, and I think in ours, freedom produces, well, obviously peace by definition, but prosperity and happiness and et cetera, et cetera. But there's also elements of freedom that you might find distasteful, i.e., letting a company that employs 100,000 people die, because that's the iterative process of identifying poorly deployed or poorly managed capital, and then recycling that and turning it into pristine, efficient new capital to go towards discovering more truth in the market, to go towards entrepreneurs taking more risk and saying, I identify this as something that people want. I'm going to try to produce it in the way in which they want it. And I live or die based on my capacity and ability to do that. You have to be okay with that process. And it seems like, in the broad trend of softening society, most likely in no small part because of the softening of the money, that there's a less and less acceptance of that process. We don't want any company to fail. We don't want any bank to fail. We don't want anyone to lose their jobs. We don't want anyone to not have this or have that, to the point where everyone gets saved now. Everyone gets a bailout, because we're not willing to say what free people do with their freedom is their obligation and their responsibility, right? There's been such a departure from that, both philosophically, ideologically, and structurally, that we get playing parts falling from the sky. And unless something changes, I would say and history is probably supportive of this, more of that's probably going to happen, right? Our institutions, our companies, all the stuff that are quote unquote beneficiaries of that, but ultimately, ultimately undone by that process, will continue to happen, and we will suffer the consequences through our safety, through safety, or through the quality of the products and services that we have available to us in the market, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I agree.
One term we haven't thrown out, and something that I think kind of underpins everything you were just talking about, and is the term of discipline, right? So, like, we have outsourced discipline through fiat money, right? It is no longer required, right? There is no required discipline for being an efficient provider of services, because the government will eventually bail you out. There is no discipline for yourself. And I've seen this in Bitcoin quite a bit, and it kind of goes back to, I've seen a lot of Bitcoiners who get on diets and lose a lot of weight, for instance, right? And they sort of realize there is something fundamental about Bitcoin and being and owning your own capital and having lower time preference that makes you more disciplined around what would seem to be unrelated places, right? Like your health. Just because you've got this money, why all of a sudden are people getting healthier, or they're drinking less, or they're spending less money, or, it just sort of, we say you can't hack Bitcoin, but Bitcoin can hack you, I think is, I've seen it all over the place. And there is this lack of discipline in our current economy, in our current society. And you see it with, I mean, in America, you see it with the health. I think I saw a tweet yesterday. The average man in America is 5'9", but 195 or almost 200 pounds. And the average woman is 5'4", 171 pounds. And you wonder why America is having so much trouble with COVID. And a lot of it is because of the obesity we have in this country. And because people have sort of accepting of this lack of personal discipline, because the state will take care of you. And so if the state's going to take care of me, why would I take care of myself? And that's because the state has no discipline. It's not required. If there's no requirement or incentive for discipline, then why do it? Right? I'm either going to get bailed out, or they're going to have some drug that will save me, or I will be considered at high risk person, so I'll get my vaccine first, even though my high risk is that I'm a chain smoker, or I'm 50 pounds overweight or 100 pounds overweight. That's my comorbidity, so I'm going to get a vaccine first. And you keep removing these disciplines from the world. And obviously, as a Marine, we incentivize discipline through lots of means. But it's also a self-choosing thing, right? You don't just become a Marine and they give you, part of it is a self-selection bias as well. But it's part of our ethos, part of who we are, is that sense of discipline. And I have always had this feeling, looking out at the rest of the world from my lens of why are people so different in this regard? And when you realize that it all comes down to the money, and when I say this to people, outside of or from thinking of it from not from first principles, and I say, yeah, if we fix our money, you'd see healthier people, you'd see healthier individuals, you'd see people that are more that they're like, you're just going to fix the money, and that seems insane, but they're so interconnected. It's so much at the basis of what we do, because yes, we all know that money is important, but not why money is important, right? Money is that thing that prices everything in our lives. It prices our value, it prices what we value. And if you deteriorate that market, right, it's like changing a unit of measurement, right? It's like changing, if you say, hey, I run a 6-minute mile, but then you change the mile to be 20% more on a given day or 20% less in a given day. How are you ever supposed to keep any sort of standard of what, or how do you keep any sort of measurement standard? And it's the same with money. If we have no idea what the money supply is, if the government's going to print another $1.9 trillion, and what do? You get headlines of Biden solves poverty for 20% of America. It's like, that's not what's happening. But yet, as Bastiat says, we have, the education, the politics, and the news all sort of are playing into this idea, and not necessarily nefariously. It's just the world that we've built. It's this lens that we've built, this idea that, if you're wronged by the state, don't worry, the state will either take care of you, or you can sue the state and they're going to give you $20 million for what they did. But the state doesn't give you anything. The state can't give you anything. They're taking it from everybody else and giving it to you. And it's, I think that the more people take personal responsibility, take discipline, and start with their money is a great place to, is the place to do it. But it certainly we see as the place. You start looking at these stories, you start looking at these headlines, and you realize, that's not what's happening. What you are saying is not the reality of the world that we live in. And I think that is what Bitcoin brings. Certainly I see that it brings is this sense of discipline, that we must take responsibility for ourselves, that the state, in America, we are founded on the idea of the separation of church and state. Well, what about the separation of the state from all of these other things that we don't separate? Education, the money.
That's what the book's about, right? That's
right.
That's the book.
That's exactly what the book is talking about. It's like, okay, separate church and state. America, we got that. We are all for it. I mean, in practice, do we really? I don't know. We've got, in God we trust.
Not anymore.
But let's just take it. We talk about that, right? It's certainly taught. It's one of our founding principles. This idea, even though well, I'm not going to undercut my own point, but we have this fundamental idea that we have this separation of church and state. So why not the separation of all these other things? And I think with the discipline of money could come this discipline of like, hey, that's not the state's job anymore. It's your job, and you have to take responsibility, and you have to deal with the consequences of it. And that's a nice thought, but with Bitcoin, it becomes a reality. And I think that's, again, we come back to Bastiat, we come back to this book of that is that missing piece, that missing tool. And for me, I think that's very extremely profound and something that I really look forward to.
I want to circle back to what John Bell said before that, where he was talking about the being okay with the consequences of letting voluntary free market action take its course, and how sometimes that's much more uncomfortable. I think a good example, and again, I point back to Bastiat's, that which is seen and that which is not seen. I think a good example of this is minimum wage law, right? Where on the surface level, people are saying, oh, well, it's unfair. It's unfair that these people are not getting paid as a living wage, whatever that means. They're entitled to more. There's a really good case study that I discovered on this in American Samoa. For anyone who's listening who doesn't know, American Samoa is a small island that is actually an American territory, and you probably never even heard about it. Like, most people don't even know about it. And their primary industry is tuna fishing and tuna canning on the island. And at one point in time, I forget when exactly it was, I'd have to go look it up, but they basically passed a minimum wage law on the island and put the tuna cannery out of business. And it's kind of like, yeah, on the surface, like, it sounds really good. It seems great. And I love that example because it's like a microcosm. It was an island economy, and they had limited resources and all these people who needed jobs, and instituting that change that probably made everyone feel great on the outset. It was like, this is going to be awesome. Everyone's going to make more money. We're all going to be happier and healthier, and there's going to be more to go around. And what did they do? They destroyed their way of life. And it's interesting too that, you look at the West, which is probably the most philanthropic society that's ever existed. I mean, granted, America's not perfect, but it's probably the closest thing to a truly capitalist system that we've had in at least a long while. And it's been one of the most prosperous nations that's ever existed, and certainly the most advanced. But yet we see huge outpourings of philanthropic organization and support and charity to try to lift people up and lift them out of poverty. But it's when it becomes coercive, it's when it becomes non-voluntary, it's when it endangers businesses through things like minimum wage laws. Like, yeah, it feels good, it sounds good, it doesn't work. It has to happen naturally. It has to evolve through people's desire to help one another. Yeah.
And I think it would. That's the thing, right? Like the insidious propensity of the state to cause people to abdicate the responsibility for so many things to it rather than taking it for themselves is one of the primary problems, right? Like, so if you think there's this massive social, so there's a moral issue with the social welfare system, right? And that is, it takes involuntary from you to redirect and give to someone else, right? So your freedoms and liberties are being imposed upon or infringed upon. But remove that for a second, and I think everyone just thinking like, oh, here's the mentality: the government will take care of it, right? Social welfare or education or defense or healthcare or whatever. People say the government will take care of it. So I think in a different sort of environment where that wasn't the case, and this question comes up all the time, I think less people would need social welfare because the market would dole out the rewards more efficiently than the market with state intervention does. So I think there'd be less need for social welfare. I think the level of prosperity generally would be higher. And so I think people would have more disposable income to potentially contribute to whatever welfare was necessary. And I think that would happen because people wouldn't de facto think that it's going to be taken care of by somebody else. And it would be far more local. Your street, your your block that you live on, your cul-de-sac, your little town or community, your city, like surely if there was people struggling tremendously there, and again, I think there'd be far fewer than there is even now, but I think there'd just be more capacity and more willingness to contribute to those who, for whatever reason, are having, issues, whether they be health, mental health, money, whatever. I think there would be a genuine social safety net. It just wouldn't be conducted by the state. It would be predicated on the morality and the values of principles of the individuals in the environment of those people, right? That's the other like incredible perversion, or one of the main impacts of the state is that it so influences the morality of the individuals in such an insidious and often subconscious and unseen way. And I think that's one of them. You don't have to both understand and refine what your own values, principles, and morals are, because you almost never, like, you don't have to express them in that often or in certain capacities or in certain forms. And it all gets delegated to the state. Another simple example is if healthcare wasn't provided by the state, one, I think it would be better and I think it would be cheaper. But if it wasn't provided by the state, I have to assume that at least a certain percentage of people would take more responsibility for their health, for the very simple reason that they would understand that nobody is there to bail them out.
Save them.
Right. So right now you can smoke all your life and can eat Cheetos all day and can do nothing and then show up at the hospital at 55 and say, like, a cancer, heart disease, and I'm obese, please fix me. And it's different in different places, but in Canada that's the case, right? You can do it and it's on the dime of the state. Whereas if that wasn't an option, if you knew you were going to have to pay for your health care, how much would that influence your decision making? I mean, I think it's impossible to refute that it would impact it in some way in the direction of, I'm going to have to take more responsibility here. So, I totally agree with that characterization. And on the minimum wage thing, and the minimum wage is a great example also of the thinking, the unavoidable thinking of centralized mechanisms of control, the uniformity of thought and action, right? Which is totally incompatible with the diversity of circumstance, situation, environment, and individuals spread out over a broad area, right? And so that's one of the funny things about today. I mean, diversity is celebrated, but equality is enforced, which are, counter to one another. But the state almost necessarily, in order to be perceived as treating everyone the same, treating everyone fairly, has to apply its rulings, let's say, with such a broad brush to a population of people that are incredibly diverse. And the minimum wage one's great. Like, it doesn't make sense for what is the market dictating is should the minimum wage be for a small, pass-through gas refueling town in Arizona where there's 100 people and one gas station and one restaurant versus a green juicing bar in Manhattan, right? Like, clearly the market is sending different signals for the value of labor in those two respective markets, right? Based on supply, demand, everything else. But the state necessarily has to think uniformly and treat everyone as the same, right? And say, doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what the market dynamics are. This is how, this is the right amount of money for people to earn in order to live a quote unquote living wage. And as you said, Colin, like, obviously, if you impose such arbitrary restrictions on self-regulating market functions, all you're going to do is fuck shit up. all you're going to do is make it so those jobs go away. And so those people, not only are they not earning $7 an hour, they're completely unemployed now. And now they're on the hook for the social welfare system. And now they feed in to, they exacerbate the problem that was already existing in the first place. And that's the tricky thing about all this is so few people, and this year has been, or last year and this year has been such a obvious example of this, but so few people have a lack of appreciation for history. This book is a great example. None of this stuff is new. Like, there's not really any new ideas floating around. The way governments get on is relatively the same. Circumstances and environment are a bit different. Technology is a bit different, but all the problems that we have now and all these issues have played out before, and they never, ever end well. And we're making all the same mistakes again. And, so that's one of the frustrating things about, we've been talking about how coming into Bitcoin and understanding all these disparate elements of it bestows a certain clarity on people. And I think someone mentioned this recently on a podcast, but we were talking about like everything comes into the world with a curse. Breedlove posed this question to us one time. What's Bitcoin's curse? And I was struggling to find like what that was. And someone, can't remember who, said like, that's it. It's the feeling of isolation by seeing things more clearly. Now, the fact that we have this Bitcoin, Bitcoiners all over the world that we get to connect with really helps to counterbalance that and maybe totally negate it. But when we withdraw to our normal meat space lives, I know a lot of us feel like we're seeing a very different world than most of the people in our direct environment are seeing. And, that can be a cause of frustration or friction or isolation. And so it was interesting for the person to identify, like, maybe that's the curse of Bitcoin or the curse of clarity or truth in general. It's that you see the lies in everything else, right? The truth is beautiful and it's enlightening, but it casts the light of truth on everything and it reveals the lies or the falsities or the delusions everywhere else. And that's something that you've got to wrestle with to develop the proper, approach to.
My favorite book in the Bible is Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. And it's something I think everybody should read, even if you don't believe in God or don't like the idea of the Bible or the church or whatever. Forget that. There's some incredible wisdom in the Bible. And Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, and Solomon said, above all, search for wisdom, get understanding, search for it like it's, find gems or precious gold or silver. And he said, with knowledge, with an increase in understanding comes great sorrow, and with wisdom comes tremendous grief.
Yeah. And, I used to tell myself something when I was younger that I guess no surprise it's informed a lot of my development, but it must have been 20 years old or something like that. And I guess I realized that the dynamic that exists in that capacity that you just characterized. And one of my, not mantras, but something that I reminded myself of frequently was, I'd rather be tormented by the truth than coddled by ignorance. Right. And same sort of thing that you just said. And, I think that's probably not the case for a lot of people today. Despite what they may, say if you pose that question to them. And so, I think that's one of the challenges of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think truth seekers have always sort of borne that cross, right? If you look at the story of the Buddha, or you look at Siddhartha, these people who went out to seek truth, objective truth, generally find themselves alone. Even the story of Christ. I mean, he had his apostles, but eventually, he was essentially his own story, his own way, and thank God, thank God for the internet. Thank God for these kind of conversations. Thank God for the community that we have, because I think everybody at some point is that crazy Bitcoiner. Whether it's within your family or within your work or within your friends or whatever it is. And we've all experienced that in some way, shape, or form. And it is, I think, part of why we fervently continue to travel down that path to try to convince more people. in a way that I would have never done with with such fervency in the past. Part of that is that I want to bring them on. Part of it, I want to help them save themselves and see what I see. But it also helps alleviate that feeling of isolation, which we all, as social animals, social creatures, as relatively removed apes, we search for that social connection. Here we are having a 3-hour conversation on a Saturday morning via Zoom, and it's part of that is the evolutionary arc that we are on. But generally speaking, I feel so much more comfortable in this world, even though it may feel somewhat isolating sometimes, than I did trying to swallow a jagged pill. The jagged pill that just felt like this underlying undercurrent of like, this isn't right. There's something incorrect. There's something wrong about this. And I think Bastiat puts it great when he says, he's talking about the state and about justice. The purpose of the law is to prevent injustice from reigning. He says, in this world in which the state provides everything, intelligence becomes a useless prop for people. They cease to be men. They lose their personality, their liberty, and their property. And I think you nailed it. You hit it right in the head, John. You said, I'd rather search for truth and be uncomfortable than accept in ignorance the lie that is being fed to us. And that's been I think that's kind of more my most powerful realization through all this is like, yeah, I'd much rather be uncomfortable in a world of truth than trying to swallow this thing that has always felt, even when I couldn't articulate it, has always felt wrong or
incomplete,
just unnameable, whatever, whatever that thing is, that just this like, is this really, this can't be it. This can't be,
and that's so common.
There's got to be more to this.
That's
what you always think.
Right.
Something I'm missing. There's an answer. I don't know what it is. It's on the edge. It's on the precipice. Like it's on the ether, and I can't grasp it. I can't see it.
And you talked about, talking about substance abuse. You talk about the depression epidemic that we had. I mean, talk about the things that are really, you call it COVID a pandemic. Let's talk about substance abuse. Let's talk about fentanyl taking out entire, communities in the United States. That's because everybody, whether they know it or not, is wrestling with the same thing that we're talking about right now, which is that underlying feeling of like either lack of hope or lack of truth or lack of understanding. It all kind of undercurrent to this sense of like, it's just right there. I can't I'm not sure what it is. And since I can't find it, you know what? I'll just put a needle in my arm because what's the difference?
Well, for some of those people, they're so scared of the truth that it actually drives them towards, that fantasy. And that's why we build these bubbles for ourselves that protect us from what's real. So, because we don't want to face it, probably more so on a subconscious or like an implicit level than.
Right. Whether we know it or not. I think that's right. That's the point, right? Like, it's like whether the guy who is, putting a needle in his arm, whether he can articulate that, man, if only I could seek truth, I wouldn't do that. Whether he's having that conversation with himself or it's just this sort of underlying sense of loss of basic understanding of what is that sort of pit in your stomach, that feeling in your heart that just sort of doesn't feel quite right. And it's something that, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there's no way I could have articulated what it was. It just sort of was this sense of ennui. That everybody risks. We're not special. We're not some special generation that's wrestling with this. I mean, Bastiat was wrestling 200 years ago. He's doing the same stuff.
I think that's part of the tragedy is that, and I've mentioned this a little bit before, but you can have that desire to seek and see truth, and you can find it within yourself, irrespective of your environment, right? But then you test it against your perception of the world. You say, like, I feel like I've come to an individual truth. What application does that have outside of me? And then you test it against the outside world and the outside environment you're in, and you're like, man, that doesn't feel congruent at all. And I think this is one of the the spiritual quandaries of the perversions that are inherent in the systems and the structures that we erect for ourselves, and that in large part we are subject to, is that they don't reflect properly the truths that we find within ourselves. And as a result, we don't feel very congruent with them. And that creates a lot of that friction, a lot of that frustration, a lot of that despair that you're talking about, that causes people to say, like, I can't figure this out. There's something in me that I feel is genuine and true, and I'm not seeing its reflection or how it fits in the outside world. And that destroys people. And what I think is so, amazing is that, you have to do each individually, but like, I think what Bitcoin is going to foster is a more genuine, the world it creates will be a more genuine expression of who each of us truly are, because the signal that we send to the world or to the market is not being as corrupted as it currently is, right? And so that means the world that we get is going to be a better reflection of who we all are as individuals, and how that looks as an emergent system. And then I think people will, when they're on their own, journeys of self-reflection and understanding and stuff like that, there'll be far more congruence with the truths they find within themselves and what they see out in the broader world. Obviously, maybe you'll never find like a perfect congruence, or maybe that's just all a matter of perspective. But I think there'll be less likelihood that people will find so much space and friction between them and the world they're surrounded by. And I think that will lead to less frustration and less despair and less substance abuse and less all of those things that emerge from being frustrated by who you believe you are and some of the truths that you find internally and what the world is showing you. And so like the world is very much it's showing people a delusion in a certain sense that is causing them, I guess, confusion about their own sanity and what they're actually seeing. And then I'm not saying there's not ways of transcending that. I think there's always ways of transcending the reality of your environment and anchoring in individual truths, but that's by no means an easy thing to do. And I think the less we can have the delusion, the less we can impose delusion on people in terms of what they perceive in their environment, the easier the journey of trying to make those two worlds congruent will be, and the less negative outcomes we'll see from that. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think an easy example, you're talking about finding a truth and then bringing it to the world to see what the world thinks of that truth. And people, anybody who's tried a diet or tried to take better care of themselves can see this, of the sort of the barriers they come up against. And I used to do a Big Brothers Big Sisters program up in when I lived in San Francisco, and I would see this with the mother of my little brother that I worked with. She was always trying to lose weight, and I would give her tips, be like, yeah, you should try this, try eating a little less carbs, try taking sugar out, whatever. And then she would come back and she would tell me stories of like, I would show up to family dinner and people would be like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you eating my pasta dish? Or why aren't you eating my dessert? Or why aren't you eating my sugar? And it would just set up these barriers against her. And if she didn't have the fortitude to seek this better health for her, or her new truth that she was trying to sort of, and it would just be this setback and setback and setback. And unless you have complete conviction in this thing that you want to do, or you want to try, or you want to see in the world, it becomes really painful. And so I think as Bitcoiners, in a way, we can sort of, be the change that we want to see in the world. And the more of us that there are, the more examples we can set of, hey, I used to do things this way. Now I'm basing my life in sats. And because of that, I'm basing my life around all these other first principles and truths, and look at, and look how much healthier I am, how much happier I am, how much more sort of curious I am, these other better changes that have come out of my life. And I think that's what I try to say. I mean, people look at me, I do OMAD, and I've always been healthy. I've always been fit. It's never been, I'm not like, nobody's going to look at me like, oh my God, you've changed so much. But when I tell people like, hey, yeah, I eat, I fast for 22 hours a day, they think I'm insane. But the more I can kind of tell them stories about how that's made my life better and made it easier, things that you wouldn't necessarily think, like it's one thing to lose some weight, but it's also to say, hey, it's also given me all this time during the day. I've got better mental clarity. I'm performing better at work. I'm making better decisions. I'm making healthier decisions with my relationships because, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then people start to get more interested. And I'll tell you, so this is a personal story for me. I actually, I suffered a snowboarding injury 5 weeks ago, right? So I actually fractured 2 vertebrae in my neck in the beginning of February. And I talked to the doctor, and she said, this is, I don't like to use the word miracle very often, but you're probably in the 5% case of not being a quadriplegic, right? You're probably 5% of the people that suffer this injury walk away from it. And I was like, that's remarkable. And, it really was a miracle. But I also, through the time, she said, you're not gonna be able to eat for the next 30 hours until we do the surgery. I said, that's fine. I generally fast about 22 hours a day anyway, so it's not a big deal. And she's like, oh, you're fasting. That's really interesting. Fasting has shown to help people recover from and have a more protective spinal fluid around their spinal cord. That may be what saved your life. And, I don't want to say Bitcoin saved my life, but, I just, these little things that kind of keep coming up in my life of like these benefits that I'm getting from my adoption of, I'm living more of a truth. Like, even with alcohol, like I was never a great drinker. I never really, but it was part of the social world that I lived in. It was part of the college experience I lived in. It's part of being a Marine aviator, for better or for worse. It's part of that culture. And I never felt comfortable with that. And now I've decided like, no, that doesn't need to be a part of my life because I'm better without it. And I can live that truth because I have these other things that are sort of this compounding interest in my life that has really had a profound effect. And I hope it's starting to have a profound effect on those around me as well. And I think that as Bitcoin becomes more adopted, that will be more and more the case as we go forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just the last piece about the congruent stuff is you guys were both saying like, you felt this like angst, this thing, like, I know I'm searching for something, I don't know what it is. And I think oppositely to the people who don't find congruence, I think understanding what Bitcoin is, seeing the effects it's having on other people that you now interact with in the quote unquote community, I think for a lot of us, it's like, yes, like that's congruent with who I am or some of the aspects of myself that I've discovered over the years. Like that's kind of what I've been waiting for, like something with those qualities that facilitates those interactions or those changes. Like, and I think that's why so many of us are excited by it, because it seems like it's like a forcing function or a tool to actually start changing the world into something far more congruent with our principles and our values and how we see ourselves and some of the deeper aspects of ourselves. And it's difficult to think of a greater gift than that, to actually align with the world that you're in, to not feel like a stranger in a strange land, to not feel like an alien, but to feel like, oh, like to have the world kind of open up to you like that. And as you say, John, to have whatever changes you're inspired to have occur in your life to take place, and then to see the effect of those, in whichever ones they may be, rub off on other people that you interact with or other people in your immediate environment, and see that foster the continuation of that trend and of the emergence of that far more congruent world around you, is intoxicating. It's a gift. It's something to be grateful for. It's, it's nothing short of amazing, really.
On that note, guys, I'm going to get going.
I was just gonna say, have we exhausted it?
Yeah,
I think we've exhausted it.
That was awesome. That was so much fun, guys. That was just, can't think of better than a Saturday morning. So,
Agreed.
Any last words, boys, before we sign off? John, I'll start with you.
Link, subscribe, and hit that bell when you get a chance. No, I'm just kidding. I don't. I'm not pitching anything. I got nothing to hawk. So, but yeah, I just, you guys, thank you for letting me come in and tag along on this stuff. I feel like I'm still a new person in this whole thing, even though, just thank you. I've learned so much today. I'm going to continue to read. I'm going to continue to explore. It's been a really awesome conversation, and I hope we get to do it again soon.
I don't have much else to add. Thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, guys, I really enjoyed this one. I appreciate both your time. Great to connect with you, Colin, again, and John for the first time. I'm sure it won't be the last. So until then, be well, boys, and have a good one.
Take care.
See ya.